Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. This is Alicia Fair, and I'm here in Nashville, Tennessee, opening up day 2 of our Community Engagement Studio virtual training. We do have a couple of housekeeping items before we get kicked off this morning. As we did yesterday, we are recording this meeting so we can have a curated, edited video for you to share with your colleagues. And we also ask that people turn their cameras on if they're comfortable. As you remember when you registered that you did or did not give us photo disclaimer release. And at 11:35 Central, we take a break today. And if you would like for Matt Shore, who's our communication specialist on the call, to actually take a screen grab when you're ready and posing, we have that opportunity available. Some people like to, primp or put a mask on or do whatever they want to do. But at 11:35, if you want to turn your camera on, Matt will come through in that 10 minutes and take a picture of you, meaning a screen grab of you since we're not in person. Also, today we're going to launch the post-evaluation of this experience at about 2 o'clock or so Central Time after our expert panel this afternoon, which is going to be incredible to hear from our research colleagues and their colleagues in the community. And that'll be facilitated by Dr. Kimberly Weiss Etheridge, or as we call her here at Meharry Medical College, Dr. Kim. And then we'll have several sessions today, and then we will make a plan to close at 3 p.m. Central. And that is the plan. I don't think there are any other announcements except to say, if you do complete your post-evaluation by May 3rd, which is Monday, those folks' names will be put into the drawing to receive 2 original pottery pieces by our colleague and artist in residence, Ed Napia. So with that, I'm going to advance the next slide and toss the baton to Tiffany Israel. Thank you everyone for joining us today.
Thanks, Alicia. Good morning, everyone. It's Friday. I hope that means something awesome for everybody and that you are blessed with phenomenal weather, whatever that is for you for the weekend. Thanks for giving us another day of your time. We greatly appreciate it. I feel like one of the things that's missing in this kind of Zoom platform is a lot of opportunity for us to actually discuss things. I love that you're putting things in chat because we can collect those and historically keep them aside and share them. And we'll also put those in our CE moderator CE adopters group, excuse me, so that people can have access to those along with all the templates and just a good place for us to share with our colleagues across the country about the studio model. But this morning, what we normally get the best feedback on when we do these across the country in person is that individuals really love the opportunity to talk with each other, to share experiences, to ask questions, to debate what was the right thing or wrong thing or better thing to do in studios. So we built in some significant time this morning just to have those chats. There were a lot of great questions and comments that came up in our chat box yesterday. And we certainly did not get to all of them related to the studio because we knew we had some time built in this morning. So with that, I'd like to do 2 things. One, we're going to open up with a poll just because they're fun and I like it and it breaks things up a little bit. And let's see how we're doing this morning. So what in the world for $500? Which CES community expert behavior caught us by surprise? All right, we're up to almost 30. I'm hoping you all can't hear the really loud baby birds that have built a nest right beside where I am. All right, 34. Give you 5 more seconds. All right, let's close it up. Okay, so 25%, a community expert who was using Zoom on her phone, got in her car, drove to Walmart and began shopping. A community expert who brought his dog to the CES. An expert that showed up with their mom who insisted on sitting in on the CES. An expert who took a phone call and began loudly speaking. An expert that excused herself to go to the restroom and appeared to be impaired when they returned, or all of the above. Y'all, it is all of the above. We have had all of these things happen in a community engagement studio, and I guess it's just because we've been doing it for so long, but that is why nothing ever shocks me anymore. So all of the above, just prepare yourself for any of these things and more adventures to happen if you decide to start doing community engagement studios at your institution. So with that, I just want to open us up for some questions and for some dialogue. I'd love to hear your feedback about the community engagement studio. And I don't want to like call on people, but I've been known to do that. I feel like you all have great energy. So you can ask any questions you'd like. And we've got all of our colleagues from Utah, Michigan, and Vandy. So Devin and Leah are here as well. So we're happy to answer any questions you had. We'd also just love to hear your feedback about just watching the studio and the interaction.
This is Carmen from Puerto Rico.
Good morning, Carmen.
Good morning. I had a great time yesterday, I have to say, and it was such a privilege to be able to look into this experience and be a part, at least listen to and see everything that was going on. I thought that I learned so much as a facilitator. I've done focus groups for a long time, but I think you managed this one with such mastery. I think it was really bringing them back to the topic, helping them open up. I thought that was really important. And I thought the participants were just fabulous. I mean, they had different points of view. They were in different places, and they all had the spirit of communicating what they thought would be helpful for others. Just gave me a lot of enthusiasm to participate. I think you did a really good selection in terms of the people that were there at different moments in the disease, different demographics. So I just want to thank you very much for this experience. And our team we are while we're watching this and participating in this, we're planning on when we're going to start this. So thank you.
That's wonderful to hear. For everybody else in the training, 2 different times our team had planned a trip to Puerto Rico, and both times some crazy natural disaster occurred. And so we just felt like that was the, higher powers saying, don't go to Puerto Rico. I didn't want to plan anything else, Carmen, because I didn't want anything else bad to happen to Puerto Rico.
Yeah, but don't worry. This will pass, and we would really love to have you here. This is something that makes a lot of sense here, especially for our researchers that have a lot of interest in having community engagement, but don't have the tools. So I think this is just really going to be very important. So thank you.
Wonderful. We welcome all invites to come see our colleagues across the country and world, I should say, because I know we have our colleagues from the UK joining us. It's interesting. Sometimes we just really luck out and have a really great group of folks that have these diverse experiences and perspectives. I thought it was really interesting. I know I commented on this yesterday when I did Richard's Zoom orientation. He was very quiet. And I said, so Richard, when we have our meeting next week, you have to promise me you'll help you open up and feel comfortable like sharing and giving feedback and advice. He said, I'm not really a talker, Tiffany. I don't really feel comfortable like sharing in those settings, but I'll try. And I was like, okay, that's not a problem. Let me give you some primers you can be thinking about so you'll feel more comfortable sharing. But one of the things that I thought was most interesting is that he did talk a lot, and he mentioned the homeopathy, and that was obviously a really important thing to him. And so someone on the outside listening in may think, oh, that's just one random person who that's really important. But I don't know if you all noticed that towards the end, Marcus mentioned, oh yeah, I take milk thistle and I drink dandelion tea. And so I thought it was really important for our nephrologists to hear that, because they may have thought Richard was just kind of a one-off, but we hear stuff about homeopathy in studios about all the chronic conditions, whether we're looking at lupus or HIV or liver disease. There's always some folks who are seeking alternatives to the heavy bouts of medication that they're taking. So I thought that was really interesting. We have a couple of stuff in our Chat box, to establish a CES in our institution, where is a good place to start? Minimum level of staff and resources, and what about institutional support? Elizabeth, that's a great question. I'm going to let our colleagues from the other institutions chat about that too, because we have some folks in here. Heidi is here with us from Heidi, New Mexico. Heidi is here with us. So everybody's in a different phase of kind of kicking off the studio program. So we've been doing it for 11 years, but then Heidi is at the beginning in her institution, as is Dartmouth. I think they've done maybe 1 or 2 of kind of kicking theirs off. So it looks really different for all the institutions. Our institution started the studio program through an NIH supplement that was affiliated with our CTSA award, so the Clinical Translational Science Award. We received an NIH supplement in collaboration with UNC and our partners there to test out community patient engagement models to enhance research. UNC took an entirely different route, a much more intensive kind of long-term collaborative relationship building between a researcher and a community. We took this other route because we didn't have researchers who would be prepared or willing to do that at Vanderbilt. So that's how we initially developed the community engagement studio model. Leah mentioned yesterday that we actually piloted it based on an existing model at Vanderbilt that used researchers as the experts to give feedback on pre-submission publications or the design elements, et cetera, all the same elements, but from a researcher perspective. So we based our model on that using community experts. When our supplement ran out, our CTSA saw the value and appreciated the feedback they were getting from their own internal leadership. And so they built it into our CTSA award. So our institution provides vouchers, which cover the cost of their community engagement studios. And we have historically provided those for Vanderbilt and Meharry, but now Jillian at Meharry is kicking off Meharry's own internal program. So they're also kind of at the beginning. So I'll be quiet, and Heidi, Jillian, some folks from Dartmouth at the beginning of this. I know Joellen's on here. If you all want to speak to maybe how you're able to start funding your program and what kind of resources you feel like should be in place.
Sure, I'll jump in. We haven't done our first studios yet. They're actually scheduled. We have 2 scheduled at the end of May, but we are also part of the Clinical and Translational Science Awards and in New Mexico, in Albuquerque. And we already have a team of 4 people that just do community engagement research in various capacities. And we already have a lot of experience with recruitment and focus groups, like all these various skills that relate directly with studios. So we all are just chipping in. We didn't hire anyone new. And we all just plan to continue with our current team with the studios. But the CTSA award, our most recent grant, is funding us to pilot the studio program so we can do it for free and have some guinea pig studies, so they don't have to pay for us to do it as we're figuring it out, but then we plan to charge after that. And I really appreciate the breakdown yesterday that Bree gave with the hours and how much they charge at Utah. That'll come in really handy as we're figuring out what to charge.
Joellen, could you share what Dartmouth is doing to kick off your program? Because you guys are even a little earlier in the process, I think.
We've hosted a few studios now, which is exciting. We just had one last week. Funding is something that I think we're still very much figuring out. We have one person at Dartmouth that really kind of pushes this through as a side job almost, as part of her job. And we actually rely really heavily on our Masters of Public Health students, which I am one. And so we have, I think, 3 MPH students right now that are working on going through and doing the vast majority of the work for most of our studios. One thing that we did that I think has been really great to get kind of our team up and running and to start spreading the word at Dartmouth is we've partnered with the Norris Cotton Cancer Center at Dartmouth. And so through some funding from the Cancer Center, we actually were able to recruit for 5 studios. So we kind of put out a call to all of the cancer researchers at Dartmouth, and they were able to kind of submit if they were interested. And we got pretty good response rate there. And we have 5 researchers that are really excited. And so we just did the first of those cancer studios last week, 2 weeks ago, and we have another one coming up on Tuesday. So that's been a really nice opportunity to kind of kick off our program.
Yeah, I will say to both you and Heidi, and I know Utah has even done some studios for some for-profit entities who've paid them for those services. But it seems like if you join the CES Adopters Group, you'll see that it's this huge continuum. There's no like right or wrong. So if you have a CTSA or CTSI, you might be able to build it into that because they are supposed to have community engagement across the continuum of their CTSA. And this is a piece of, or an element that they could include in that. If you have qualitative cores, this could be, tucked under a qualitative core, possibly as a piece of a service. Or if you have a community engagement research core, it could fall under that. We do have researchers, even though you can receive vouchers at Vanderbilt, that will write the cost of the studio into their proposals, because we always tell folks there is no guarantee on vouchers. We've never received from our leadership, you can only do X number of studios a year. But because of that, we also know there's no guarantee. So we let researchers know, apply for your voucher. Once you have your voucher, we can do it for you. But if you wait and then you get funding a year from now, then we can't make you any guarantees. So they'll just write it into their grant proposals at this point, which I really like to see. That's nice. George asked a question about what methods work best to enable participants to share as much as they can, but also recognize that there are some time limitations. That's a good question. I will say I'll go first and then let my other colleagues jump in. For me, it's just a delicate balance, and every studio is so incredibly different. I try to let people tell enough of the story to give context for the researchers. But as soon as I sense that it's starting to veer off into an area that I don't feel like the researchers will understand how to incorporate into their study. So if they start talking about other family members who have different health conditions that aren't necessarily related, and I can't figure out a way in my head really quickly to tie it to the project, or if we have this happen a lot, if we start going down a path where the patient experts, our community experts are patients in this forum, they start asking a lot of health questions. Then I usually will like kind of jump in and say, I know that it's so tempting because we have two phenomenal physicians today in front of us to ask a lot of health questions, but I want to caution us because they're not your provider. And it's really important that you talk to your provider about these things. But also I want to keep us on track today. We only have 2 hours, and as you guys can see, it is flying by. And usually people are like, oh yeah, okay. They don't get upset or frustrated. I'm usually pretty lucky with that. So I would love to hear from, Megan or Bree or anyone that's on that has some other ideas. For me, it's just every studio is really, really differently. And I just keep trying to pull us back to the question that we're asking.
Yeah, I can share just a little bit. So one thing I think that's just really helpful is setting that expectation at the very beginning. Like just coming out and being straightforward and saying, look, we have so much to cover. I'm sure you guys have so much experience and expertise to share, but we only have a limited amount of time. So let's be mindful of, focusing on the topic at hand, sharing the space, making sure that everyone has the opportunity to participate. So I think that's an important part. And I also think it's asking the right questions so that we get to the meat of the conversation.
Yeah, Megan?
Yeah, I was gonna chime in that I received a great tip for facilitation when you have a over talker, especially, is kind of summarizing the last 3 words that they said. So saying, or the last kind of sentence, yeah, I hear you that you're saying about that you think the vaccine was rushed. What do you think, Tiffany? So you're hearing them and then moving on. That's been a great tip. I actually find sometimes my difficulty is the faculty want to talk a lot. So trying to steer them to say, well, let's make sure we get through all of your questions. We're tight on time, the same things. And also trying to still remain neutral of summing up to, okay, what I heard from everyone was that we think this high blood pressure study is really important, but we're worried about extra testing that has to be involved. So that's something that's helpful too. I sat in on a studio that Tiffany did, so I got to watch the best. So trying to listen in on others that I think do it really well. We have one of our staff people is a trained facilitator through a training she did with Michigan State University. So and reading different facilitator guides and things like that. But it's definitely a skill. Sometimes our scribe too, she'll jump in if somebody's really oversharing at some point, and she'll be like, oh, hey, really quick, what was that point? Just so I make sure I have it right on the note. So I guess it's sort of a team effort for sure.
I was going to say there's nothing more awkward than after you've had like a moment with a faculty PI where you've had to like really like be firm with them in a studio space to get them to be quiet. There's nothing more awkward than when you get on the elevator with them and you're like, good morning. Like, how are you today? Because it isn't awkward. They're not used to not being in charge of a room a lot of times. And so it can be awkward depending on their level of forgiveness and grace, to be quite frank. I've had PIs when I've said in a room, you know, so and so, I'm so sorry, but I'm really mindful of time. And they've been like, oh, I'm sorry, I'm doing it again, I'm talking too much. And they really own it. And they're really graceful and give a lot, they're very humble about it. But others, I can tell just by their body language, they kind of stiffen up and they get really like quiet. And I try to keep warming them up throughout the studio, but that's really awkward sometimes. Leah and Devin, you guys do some facilitating too. Did you want to jump in here with any thoughts about that?
Devin, anything?
I don't know that I have too much to add.
I think Brianne's or Bree's point too about sort of setting expectations in our faculty meeting too. We'll say, we just want you to sit back and listen and relax. And then the same thing when we're doing the orientation with the experts. If you're the more quiet person, we want you, like Tiffany said yesterday, we definitely want you to step up more. I think the Zoom features have helped a little bit too. Raise your hand, reactions. I have one expert that only participates solely through the chat. So, you know, we're just sort of take it and also have to say, oh, I saw Jane made her point about this.
That's
kind of
really
going with the flow, right?
I will say one. Oh, go ahead, Tiffany.
No, you go, Leah. I was going to jump to the next question, so go, please.
I was just going to mention something that I think we thought would be more helpful initially, was using the chat feature with our investigators. So we initially thought that maybe having investigators sort of message the facilitator or message the member of staff to, you know, ask additional questions would be great. Like, oh, what a great way to use the chat feature. But we've actually found it to be incredibly distracting. So we, in a lot of cases, sort of discourage our investigators from using the chat feature to communicate with the facilitator, since they're sort of already having to watch the chat for expert comments or to communicate with their scribe or another member of staff. So that was something just initially that we thought was going to be great, but then we found that investigators were sort of overusing it to try to control, again, the direction of the conversation. So just something to be mindful of. Obviously, I think it depends on the investigator, but I think it's been more distracting than helpful.
Yeah, I will say to Leah, Leah's point really quickly, we even have, so because Zoom allows multiple folks from research teams to be in listen only mode. So we only have 2 research team members who have their camera on. Everyone else can call in and listen. So that means we had a multi-site clinical trial. I think this was the COVID one, Leah and Devin, correct me if I'm wrong, where we had probably almost a dozen research team members in listen only mode. And one of the co-PIs from another site who we really had not had a lot of interaction with was rapid fire sending me chats to like, you need to call on this person. You need to ask this person these questions. You need to, and I messaged Leah and said, please make so-and-so stop chatting me. She's my buffer because it was just rapid fire. And then the co-PI actually sent us an apology later and was like, I'm so sorry. I see how that could have been really distracting. And I wished I jumped in. I just got excited. So yeah, that happens sometimes as well. I think I cannot see everyone's windows, but I got a chat. I think, Kyra, did you have your hand up?
I did.
Jump in, please.
Yeah, I usually just raise my hand because the whole Zoom environment, jumping in, interrupting. I'm just so I usually just raise my hand. But yeah, I think to the point of, I guess, this conversation, one of the things I appreciated most was that it wasn't the PI that was doing the facilitating, and that you kind of keeping that neutral zone so that it doesn't feel like this kind of rapid fire. Or that it doesn't feel like, or at least from the participants or the community expert standpoint, that dynamic. I did want to ask though, just I guess in the spirit of, so at the end of the studio, like I think you had kind of winded down the community experts, and then I noticed that the PI started asking questions. From an observer standpoint, that felt a little disorienting, and I was wondering if that was actually part of the script or if that was spontaneous, because I noticed it, and a part of me feels like that was probably spontaneous.
Yeah, it was all spontaneous. I mean, the whole studio was I mean, in a way spontaneous, right? That was definitely a live studio with, anything
Right.
could have happened. We had no idea. So I'm glad that it's over. but but yeah, that was completely spontaneous. And one of the challenges yesterday is that we normally have a full 2 hours.
Mhm.
So I would have made some more breaks in there for the research team to ask questions than I did yesterday. But because we were on such a tight schedule, and it wasn't even I have to finish an hour and a half. I need to finish an hour and a half and jump back into the Zoom with you guys. So I was really mindful of time.
Mhm.
Normally in that scenario, I would say, even if we were doing the 2 hour studio, I would say, oh, these are great questions. Well, before I take anyone else's time, community experts, do you all have about 5 minutes to cover this? Or would you prefer me email you to follow up and you guys could answer via email? I would have done something like that. And if experts needed to leave, they could have, and the ones who stayed would have answered the question. I really quickly was trying to think what's the fastest way I can get concise feedback for her on this topic so that we can wrap up, because we were already 3 or 4 minutes over. And so I felt like that was probably show of hands, head nods. That was like the fastest way I could get that.
Which was good. And I think from the observer standpoint, I feel like that was a good learning experience being on the outside of that, because I think it drove home like when we talk about the components that you need for a studio, one of the things, that was mentioned was a facilitation guide. Because I know, even with doing sessions of different types, sometimes when you are in the chair doing the facilitating or a part of the group, you don't realize the impact of maybe steering away from certain things and how that might feel on, those who are participating. And so that's what that made me kind of realize when I noticed kind of, just that shift between, okay, we're winding down, and then it was like, oh, well, what do you think about this? And what do you think? And it was like, noted. Let me make sure that, just keeping those things in mind. Like that was kind of the learning part for me.
Yeah, I tell you, I learned something in every single studio I do. I walk away from every single one and I'll sit with it for like a day or two and kind of reflect on, could I have done that differently, better? How could I have handled that? I'll tell you, one of the most intense Zoom studios we've done, and it was right at the beginning of our Zooms, is we did a series of studios to inform a COVID social media campaign related to enrolling into research. And we recruited nationally. We did 3 studios. They were all recruiting folks in hotspot cities. So we had one for African-American, Black Americans. We had one for Spanish speaking bilingual bicultural Americans. And then we had one for 65 and older. I think I mentioned that yesterday. And everyone had some form of chronic health condition, which would make them more susceptible to catching COVID. And one of the first studios that we did was with African-American, Black Americans. And I knew a handful of folks in there who had participated before, who had organizing backgrounds, but had since moved from Nashville. And we kicked off, with a little presentation about the purpose of the project. And then, so my first question was, I would really love to get your all's feedback around the messaging that this study has kind of crafted. How did it hit you? What were your first impressions, et cetera? And one of the men in that studio said, he just kind of leaned back in his chair and he said, I gotta be honest with you, Tiffany, I don't think any of us give a shit about this study right now. We got too much going on in the world. And I was like, I hear you. Let's sit with that for a minute. Let's talk about the things that are important right now. Let's talk about the things that are hitting your community. What do you want to talk about today? Let's talk about it. And I messaged the research team member and said, I'm just letting you know, I don't know where this is going to go, but we're going to unpack this because it's obviously, this is important and it's a priority. And they were like, no, absolutely. We spent the first 30 minutes of that studio having dialogue just about where our country was and what the priorities were for their communities where they lived. And we just talked about it and asked strategic questions. Well, so knowing that that's occurring in your community, how are people going to react when someone approaches them to be involved in a research study? So I tried to continue to bring it back to research in a way, but still let us focus on unpacking what was happening. And by the end of the first 30 minutes, everybody seemed a little less like, okay, got it out there. We needed to say it. And one of the members of the community experts said, but listen, let's get back to your study for a second, because I've been thinking about this. You know, this vaccine is important to the community, and so they brought us back to the project. I didn't have to. They brought us back to the project when they were ready and when the time was right for them. And it ended up being a phenomenal studio. And the two research team members later, we had a little debrief, and they were like, that was exhausting for me emotionally, like spiritually. I'm so glad you were facilitating that and your team was there. I don't think I could have handled that kind of conversation. But these were like two very middle-class white women who have no work in this space whatsoever. And so it was good that they just sat back and listened and got to hear from folks in our community across the country. That was one of the most intense studios I think we've done via Zoom, but that was, you know, sometimes you just need to sit back and be quiet. Other colleagues from across the country doing studios, if you've had some other facilitation challenges that have pushed you as just like a human?
Yeah, I think I believe Felicia and Marquetta are on this call who were in this studio where we had someone, it was around COVID. I think it's just been so difficult for this particular person was very isolated, was only doing curbside pickups and things like that, and was getting really emotional because she felt like the others in her circle were saying she was being too cautious and things like that. And we actually stopped and just, you know, let her take a pause. And Felicia actually gave her this really beautiful sentiment and inspirational statement about her efforts. And it was really nice. And I felt like that studio actually just sort of became a group therapy. It was just very cathartic for the entire group that they didn't feel so alone with the choices that they were making around COVID.
Yeah, I wonder, did you all notice yesterday, like Dennis and a couple of other folks were like, it was just really great connecting with people. It was great hearing their stories. It was nice to see where different people were. We hear that in studios constantly. Hey, Megan, I see you have your hand up, and I think I'm lucking out just because you're on my screen.
Yeah, so I have to admit that this studio happened when I was on maternity leave this fall, but it's something that my group and I have discussed, and I'm curious as to if anyone else has sort of come across this and how you addressed it. So we've done 3 virtual studios now since the start of the pandemic. And with the one studio we had in the fall, we have had a community facilitator for every single studio we've done. We haven't done any of the facilitating ourselves. So we ran into this issue where it was almost like the community facilitator throughout the process of like working with the facilitator to put together the guide and everything, she was very pushy with her own beliefs. And it almost got to the point where like, it was very hard for my teammates to like sort of work through that. It was almost like she should have just been a community expert rather than a facilitator. And like, that was really hard to navigate because it was like 2 days before we're supposed to have the studio. And we're like, how do we find another facilitator? Or how do we work with the one that we currently have to make sure that she's not like, we loved her passion, but I think that we're afraid it was going to honestly steer the studio in a way that, you know, that she would have taken over it. So I'm just curious if you've come across that or if anyone else has and how it's been addressed.
It's actually why we transitioned for a little while to not using community facilitators, to be honest, as we had a few different incidents. I had one where a facilitator stated, oh, I would never join this study in the studio, or just oversharing of their own personal relations to that. And not all of our facilitators did it, but we had it happen so many times that we sat back and said, we really need a strong facilitators training. Because some of these, and we needed to choose our facilitators more carefully. So someone might think, oh, if you would fit into this demographic because you have this health condition or you've been a caregiver, et cetera. And I'll give you an example. I was passing off all of our studios with caregivers of children who have autism to my old boss, because I have a child who is autistic. And I was like, don't want to be in that space in that way, trying to facilitate a dialogue when I have really strong opinions and values around that. So I was passing them off to her. But if we do a studio with individuals who are autistic, I'm happy to facilitate that. But that caregiver perspective, I just know it's one of those things really sensitive to me. So, you know, and as social workers, we all have this thing, like you have to kind of know your limitations, what demographics you can work with effectively, populations based on your own kinds of stuff. So yeah, that's an example of where I was like, oh, I can't do that. But we have chatted with Utah, and we've chatted with others about, we have a draft facilitation training. But I would love for colleagues across the country to come together to create a facilitation training. I know that Dartmouth, I think, applied for a grant to put together some training as well. And so I just feel like all of us across the country coming together, because we've learned so much from others who are adapting this model and utilizing it. So we are not the end all to be all at Vanderbilt just because we created it. We love seeing people's adaptations and infrastructure. I tell Bree all the time, I love Utah really rocks at creating like infrastructure, like forms, and that I just love their stuff. That's not my jam at all. So we always learn a lot from everybody. We need a good, strong, I think, facilitators training.
I agree. And I think like I'd be happy to be involved in however that may look, because I think, especially like I said, we've had like, so we've done 3 virtual and we've done 3 in person, and we've been fortunate enough to use a community member every time. Did I think it was appropriate every time to use a community member? Not really. I think, though, I'm trying to teach my boss a little bit about like the flexibility of the model. Like I think she takes a lot of it as like, as is, like it's Bible. So just trying to, you know, it's a learning process. So I think I would definitely be interested in being able to have a facilitator's training, because I think it's not just facilitation in traditional sense, it's definitely in niche. So yeah, that would be great.
And like you said, like knowing your limitations. I've worked with so many demographics of folks across the country in my career, but there are always like new little pockets of folks that I'm like, oh, I've spent the entire first half of my career working with youth. I'd never worked with transgender youth. So when we did that studio, I pulled in a colleague of mine who his whole career had been doing youth organizing, and his organization actually had a really vibrant LGBTQ program for youth. And I knew he was going to be way better at it than me. And my opportunity to watch him facilitate that was going to be a really cool opportunity. So I attended the studio. I actually utilized a Vanderbilt studio or a Vanderbilt student who is transgender to take notes. And I just sat back and listened and took notes myself and kind of learned and watched how skilled he was. And so that was a great learning opportunity for me. So I think that's important too, is kind of acknowledging when there's someone more appropriate maybe to facilitate a studio for whatever reason it might be. If it's okay, I'm going to jump over to some questions and we can all answer them. So can you talk a little bit about conducting a studio with seniors when hearing can be an issue, as well as confusion with technology? So I will say that we have not had a studio that I'm aware of, Leah and Devin jump in if I'm saying this wrong, with seniors who have had trouble hearing. We have not had that yet. I have done those in person before, and it wasn't the entire room as much as it were 1 or 2. And I sat them where I could stand to facilitate, and I would not ad nauseum, but try to repeat and capture what others in the room were saying, because one member had already told me he had a little trouble hearing. So I just stood in kind of their space while I was facilitating to make it easier for them to hear. But also remember, in person, we're writing in real time. So I'd also direct folks to the feedback. And so we would try to write it large enough and clear enough that folks could also see that. So there were a couple of ways we could manage that in an in-person setting. We have not had that issue with Zoom yet. So I don't feel like I could personally answer that one. In terms of confusion with technology, it's those Zoom orientations where we really try to walk folks through. When I did a Zoom orientation with one of the members from yesterday's studio, they were using their phone, and it took them probably about 6 minutes to figure out how to get their screen on and unmuted. And then once we figured it out, I was like, great, let's turn it off and try it again so that we can make sure that it'll work for you tomorrow. We've had one studio member who, I know Devin and Leah know who I'm talking about. They warn me if I'm not the person doing the Zoom orientations for some reason, they'll say, hey, there's this really great community expert, but they're going to have a lot of trouble with technology, or they're going to have a lot of trouble. And sure enough, during that studio, it kept dropping. They kept trying to help him get back in, and we just kind of went with it. And as soon, I would tell folks in the meeting, if so-and-so is able to log back in, just know I'm going to pause us for a second because I want to capture their feedback just in case we lose them again. And they were like, oh yeah, okay, absolutely. So that prepped everybody. Bree said set expectations, or Megan said set expectations. So that's what we tried to do. Is there anyone else on our Zoom today who has done Zoom meetings with folks who hearing or technology was a challenge, and you have some thoughts to share on that?
Tiffany, I just wanted to add, because we spoke about this yesterday, one of the things we really love about having a third member who's in charge of tech. So when we do have participants who are struggling with technology, that person can step off the call and work with them one-on-one to make sure that they're comfortable even during the studio.
So has anybody, oh, this is Robin at UC Irvine. Has anybody successfully used the translation thing at the bottom of the Zoom calls? I know that we've used that for some focus groups, and they use that for a start on the transcription. And I think that was really interesting. It's not a great, it's not complete. It doesn't have, so they get a lot of words wrong. And of course the punctuation is never in the right spot if it exists at all. But I think that might be helpful. I think it was actually created for students who have hearing issues. We haven't used it for a studio for ourselves, but we have it in different webinars and that kind of thing. So I thought I'd throw that out there.
Yeah, I'll say we at Vanderbilt have not used it, but has anyone else on the Zoom today used that feature?
We've downloaded it just to kind of compare and see if we've missed anything. It doesn't do a great job of saying who's saying what, and there are some errors, as Robin mentioned, but it is an additional resource. And we're also looking into, there's a translation or interpretation feature too, where we're looking into using that for an upcoming session studio.
I would say at Vanderbilt, we have done a couple of different studios where we've used interpreters, which have been interesting. So we've had a facilitator who was English speaking and an interpreter who spoke Arabic, and he was translating during the studio for us. That was the only way we were going to get the information, is to have that translator, which is interesting. It adds this layer, right? So there's like kind of two facilitators in a way, because you don't, how things are being translated, you can't even pick up on the nuances of language in that scenario. But the researcher gave us good feedback. I think the community experts' feedback was good. Devin's nodding yes, so that's good. I know that Bree answered in the chat a couple of questions about how they give their report back, and also that they do offer a formal training for scribes. I should mention too that we'll have breakout rooms this afternoon. So if there's a particular topic you really want to learn more about, if you want to learn more about Bree's scribe training, if you want to talk about facilitation, we've got multiple areas. You can just choose to hop into a breakout room this afternoon, have smaller discussions, ask your questions, dig in deep. And then if you're like, okay, I have my questions answered about scribing, I want to jump into this other one, this data collection one, you'll come back into the main room and they'll just slide you into a different breakout room. So hopefully that's going to be an opportunity for you to dig even deeper into some of those other topics that you're interested in. I'm wondering about who comes up with questions. In the breakout sessions, it seemed like facilitators were, but I thought previously researchers would come up with the questions. So I can tell you the way it works for Vanderbilt, and then other colleagues can jump in. During our planning meeting, we essentially ask the research team, what kind of information are you hoping to get out of this studio? So when you walk away at the end of the 2 hours, what would be a success for you? And then we kind of have to like walk them through what that might look like. So it might be identifying strategies for recruitment or retention, or what the barriers might be, and then wrapping around to the strategies. They might say that they are wanting to get feedback on the feasibility of the implementation, and is that the right way to go about implementing the project. We get a lot around messaging now. Messaging and materials is one of those things that we get a lot of questions about. And those are always really straightforward studios that usually have some other kind of little nuances to it. If we're talking about, issues around dissemination or analysis, then we try to tap into the perspective of the person who's the focus of the research study, because they may come up with a different lens to view the information through. They're going to have a lot of other community-based outlets that they think dissemination is really important. So we just ask them what they want to know. Then our team actually develops the questions. I had said in our little breakout room the other day, it always shocks me how many researchers come up with close-ended questions, just yes, no questions, which obviously will not have a lot of value, but they still do that. Would you join this study? Like, I feel like we're not going to get a lot of information out of that, just as an example. So I'm curious, other colleagues, are you all creating your kind of loose facilitators guides based on your feedback with researchers?
So at Meharry, when we have our planning meeting with the researchers, we do ask them to come with questions. And then in the meeting, we work through those questions on what they should be, what they should look like, to make sure that we're answering what they're looking for. And then we also come up on the side like prompter questions. So underneath them, so like, if we open a wide open question, we're not getting anything, we kind of list some prompter questions just so we have that in our back pocket when we start the studio.
I just want to jump in really quick on the questions. So I have a very strong qualitative background, even though I haven't done studios yet. But I'm going to post a reference in the chat that I highly recommend on good interviewing techniques, which can definitely apply to facilitating studios. And it talks about how to write open-ended questions. But a very common thing that I do with any when people give me close-ended questions, I just change it to like, tell me what you think about blah, blah, blah. That's just a really easy way to shift the question to be more open-ended. So rather than, would you join the study? Tell me what you think about the study. Or when you're trying to prompt for more information, tell me more. Those are just really easy go-tos to get more information.
Yeah, I'll say when we're informing messaging, we might use questions like, what about this study did you find interesting? What about this study caught your attention? And those are the kinds of things that then we'll prioritize in the messaging feedback that we give to researchers, the things that really resonated with community folks. And then we also do the opposite. What about this study really turns you off? What are some reasons why you would be hesitant to join the study? And then we'll wrap back around and try to address whether or not those are things that we can even make changes to. Right? We can't make a bad study good. And we all know that sometimes there's just some bad studies out there. I don't know what to say. Ed, I think I see you have your hand up.
Yes, thank you, Tiffany. So what I wanted to say with, first of all, in terms of questions for our studios, those are pre-negotiated between the researchers, the Community Faces of Utah organization, and the facilitators. So we already know what questions we're going into the studio with. And actually the researchers have very little or almost no interaction in the studio itself. It's just between the facilitator and the group. Now, one thing that we find works is that we have two facilitators in most of our studios. One facilitator is a member of the group, of the community group that's been investigated or that's involved in the discussion, and the other facilitator is an academic. And between the two of us, we tend to negotiate the questions. Now, I just wanted to talk a little bit about how we've used the chat in a way that really worked for me when I was facilitating. And Bree was the co-facilitator, but I was doing all the talking, which I tend to do. Bree would just send little recommendations, time recommendations, question recommendations through the chat just between her and I that the other participants didn't see. And it really worked quite well. Sorry, that's all I have to say. Aren't you lucky?
Thank you so much, Ed. Thank you. I was actually scrolling through the chat a bit because I've noticed that all of our colleagues are being great about trying to answer people's questions in the chat. And I wanted to make sure that folks knew that the chat can be like downloaded and saved, and we can clean it up and send it to everyone.
Great. That was my concern too.
Yeah, someone smarter than me is doing that, but yes, that's gonna happen. So you guys will get all the answers to the questions that are being asked. And so I'm just kind of scrolling through, and I saw Heidi had a lot of questions, and I'm not sure if someone's answered them yet because I haven't gone that far through. But yes,
I think those are easy to do to answer via chat. If I have some talk time, I have some like better discussion questions.
Yeah, but I do think you asked a great question about sharing. We are happy to share the notes and recommendations from yesterday's studio with everyone. I don't think that will be a problem. But I'll just let everybody know that now so they'll have a chance to see it. But did you have other questions, Heidi?
Yeah, so I know in the past you and I and your team have talked a lot about who to include, what specific populations to include in studios, and in the past, you were very adamant about only having, like in New Mexico, for example, only having the Latino, Latinx people in a group rather than Latinx and white people. Yesterday, obviously, there were Black and white people. I'm just wondering, I'm just having such a hard time deciding who to include in these groups, how you choose when to mix cultures, races, or not.
Yeah, for sure. So I'll say honestly that for me, there's no like exact science to this. We just kind of like go with what our gut instinct tells us. So for that particular project, we knew that both researchers really wanted to make sure that Black and brown voices were represented in the studio. We could not recruit any Latinx folks for that studio. We tried, and we couldn't. And I will tell you, historically, we have had a really difficult time recruiting folks who have kidney disease, which is crazy to me because it's not that uncommon of a problem, unfortunately. But we even a couple of years ago went to the kidney disease walk on a Saturday, like 5 of us, and we passed out flyers and we talked to people and we talked to families, and the Kidney Foundation pushed it out, and we still had trouble recruiting for that studio. It's the craziest thing to me. So, and I don't know if you noticed yesterday that we talked about support groups, and there are no local support groups here. We have one that's a little bit outside of Nashville, and it only has like 10 people. And so that's just like surprising. So just because we knew we had such a difficult time recruiting, we decided as a team that we felt like that common struggle of dealing with kidney disease was enough, that we felt like folks were going to have enough in common, that it was a shared experience. B, we would over recruit. So I think if you noticed yesterday, we like over recruited Black Americans to be in that studio so they could dominate that space if that's what they needed and wanted to do. So hopefully that would make them feel more comfortable knowing that was like their space. So that's why we went that direction with that particular studio. Is really, it was just A, the recruitment challenges, and B, we felt like from a disease standpoint, we thought there would be enough in common with folks that would pull them together. We also weren't speaking about things that I also think are unique experiences for folks related to the healthcare system. So we weren't asking them to enroll in a study. If I was asking folks to enroll in a study, then I feel like the questions and the experiences might have been really, really different. And I would have opted not to have mixed demographics of a group. But this was just getting feedback on a survey and supports and resources that they felt like would be helpful for folks that were struggling with this particular disease. Does that help? Okay. And folks can chime in if you felt differently about it or you thought it could have been done better. We're here to learn too. I did not sense that during the studio anyone felt uncomfortable sharing. I didn't pick up on that, but we'll also let you know when we get our evaluations back if anybody shares anything that we can learn from. Any other thoughts about the studio yesterday? Questions, feedback that would be helpful for our team?
It looks like there's a question for Ed from Robin.
Ed, how did you navigate having one facilitator being part of the group of experts, like a plant?
You know, he mentioned that when he was speaking just a minute ago, and I thought, what?
Yeah, so no, so for example, if it were the American Indian group and I work with American Indians, I would be one facilitator coming from the group itself. And then the other facilitator would be someone from CCTS.
Oh, it was not part of the expert group, not serving as an expert,
No,
but
no.
from that culture or
From
from that
that, yes.
demographic or
That,
got
right.
it.
That was familiar with working with that particular group. And I think Bree might be able to elaborate on this. I think they might have done that for some of our other groups. I know when they work with our African refugee group, I think one of the facilitators also translates, but I'm not sure about that.
Thank you.
And Fahina might talk about that a little later. Oh, go ahead, Bree, sorry.
No, that's okay. Ed, you answered Robin's question perfectly. And that is part of the benefit of having these community connections, is that when someone is talking to someone that they feel understands them and has a similar background, it makes the conversation flow a little bit better, because there's that trust and that commonality that exists. So we don't use them for every session, but when we do like a studio with just one particular background or community, then we may utilize our community facilitators for that.
I like that idea. Thank you.
Hi, it's Yolanda. I read that question a little differently. I have the opportunity of being both a contract community facilitator as well as a community expert. And when I go into the studios, I wear the particular hat that I'm assigned that day. Some days I'm a patient. Sometimes I'm representing a community-based organization, and sometimes I have to go in and be a facilitator. I like there was a point mentioned earlier about creating a facilitator's toolkit. And what I would encourage anyone to include in your facilitator's toolkit and training is implicit bias training, looking at making sure that the person coming in to facilitate, representing whatever community that they are representing, is aware of their biases and how they show up and how those can be communicated during studios. So sometimes when I'm asked to be a participant, I go in and I'm not Yolanda, I'm not trying to help Tiffany or Leah rewrite the questions. I'm not trying to help the group. My job that day is just to answer and give my expert opinion as a patient or as a caregiver or as a community-based organization. So I think that to the degree an organization can help prepare the persons coming in to understand their role for that day, somewhat mitigates that bleeding and crossover.
I should say that Yolanda is particularly good at that. Not all of our folks are good at that. She's really great at that, of like setting some boundaries and putting those hats on. And, we have learned over the years that community engagement studios are stepping stones for patients and community members to jump into research in different roles if they have that interest. We've had community experts who've been hired to work for research studies. We've had some who have been brought on advisory boards. We had one who was a community expert and then moved into being a national co-PI for a study. So it's really a stepping stone for those folks who get like really interested and want to do more in research. There's a lot of different roles that they can play. And I don't know if you all are seeing this across the country in the spaces you work in, but we are getting more and more and more requests from researchers to identify patients that they can collaborate and partner with, whether it's as I know some people use the term as citizen scientists, we use the term community investigators, but advisory councils, like we get requests pretty frequently through our core from researchers who are looking for patients from a certain demographic or a disease pattern that they'd like to collaborate with. We utilize the community engagement studio model for the Recruitment Innovation Center, which is a part of the NIH. And the community engagement studios is one of the key services that you can receive. And we did one, for instance, for a research team out of the University of Washington, and following it, they reached out and said there were these 2 experts that were really active in the call today, and we'd love to reach out to them. And so we'll email those experts and say the research team would love to connect with you to see if there's some opportunity for consulting or being a part of their project. Can we share your information? If they say yes, then we just connect them, and we kind of step out at that point. Unless they're internal investigators at Vanderbilt, where we can provide like some support about how do you work with community investigators and why should you compensate them and why should you have a job description, those sorts of things. So that's getting a little out of studio space, but a lot of times when you do this work, you're going to be called upon to do some of those other things because you'll have these connections in place, I feel like. We had a community expert who introduced themselves one time as they introduced their community role first, but then said, and I am also a community or I can't remember the term they used, but research was a part of the way they introduced themselves. And it was this aha moment for our team where we were like, oh, see, if they are starting to identify themselves as a part of the research world, they no longer can be a community expert, like they've transitioned, and that's okay. But we don't utilize that person anymore for studios because we've recognized that their lens is different now. And that's okay. They just have a different lens. Other thoughts, questions, things you all want to share? Anybody see any themes come out of the studio yesterday if you were writing up recommendations?
I see Ed's hand is up, and I had earlier that Robin's hand was up. I don't know if her question got answered.
Let's start with
That
Robin.
was just the Ed question. Yeah.
Okay. So, here's the reason why you probably never want me to be involved in any of your projects, because, I kind of like operate off the hip. I'm a bit of a loose cannon. And even as a facilitator, if I'm in a situation where I'm there to be part of a group just to respond to questions, that's one thing. But when I'm a facilitator, I don't hesitate to switch roles, because sometimes when I tell my story, it helps the people feel a little bit more liberated to go deeper into their stories. Like yesterday, if I was a facilitator for the group on the kidney issue, I tell them, hey, listen, I'm a kidney patient. I have only one kidney. These are some of the things that I have to do. I want to know how much water I have to drink and all that sort of stuff. And also, if I were on dialysis, I know that water is a factor that you have to limit on. See, I would sort of like overstep my boundaries, and I know that. And then sometimes a lot of our students that come in to support their research professor, I don't let them sit around and just observe. I want to know their stories and how that fits into the discussion. It might be a bad thing, but I do it all the time and they still have me. So I thought I'd just say that.
Well, that's good. It's good that you're collaborating with Utah, Ed.
Yeah, actually, last I heard they wanted to send me to, I think they wanted for me to apply for a job at Meharry or Vanderbilt. One of those places. I'm not sure. No, thank you.
Your application has been accepted and approved. Ed, we'll be waiting for you.
I can appreciate why you feel the urge to do that. And I'd be curious from all of our qualitative research colleagues that are on here, why they don't do that when they're facilitating focus groups and things of that nature. I think that all of us carrying these like life experiences probably can find something to relate to. And most of the studios that we do, to be quite frank, I am incredibly careful to try not to shape the dialogue, not shape the feedback. I think that's what's really most important. Prior to doing studios, I conducted a lot of focus groups. And I think it's really, really important to make yourself relatable, but also not, again, kind of shaping the feedback and the information that you're getting. And it's a fine line. It's a delicate balance. So I think that that's kind of important. But Heidi, I see you have your hand up.
Thank you. So before I get to my next question, one thing that really stood out to me yesterday that I wrote down and highlighted, I just loved it at the very beginning. I can't remember who said it. She said regarding the doctors that she's seen, that they act like they're the experts. It's a collaboration. You went to school for this, but it's my body. I loved that so much.
I just want you to know that Bree is enthusiastically nodding at your phenomenal note taking.
So I am really curious about your voucher system, because we've talked about doing something similar. We have a little bit of funding to provide studios free of cost to some investigators, but not everybody. So what does the voucher system look like? I know you said you haven't turned anyone away, but how, if you had too many, how would you choose who to keep and who to turn away?
Yeah, absolutely. And Colleen, if you don't mind jumping in here, I was just going to set some context, but I feel like you know significantly more about the voucher system than I do. And I can just speak kind of high level in terms of, for us historically, as I said earlier, we've never been told we have a limitation. But I will say that if we reached a point where we have a lot of repeaters, once someone does a studio from a particular department, like say cardiology, ICU, I think we mentioned this yesterday, infectious disease, then everyone from their department hears about it and starts coming for community engagement studios, which is why we don't advertise at all. So I think what would probably happen for us is we have had multiple researchers who have done a series of studios to inform their project. So I think telehealth was one of the ones that was mentioned yesterday, and we did 3 studios with distinct patient populations. We did one around flu vaccines, and we did one with folks who constantly will not get their flu vaccine for their child, and those who have but then have changed their mind, just to get the different perspectives on that. We did one for a LGBTQ project that was a social media campaign around oral health, and we divided the groups up based on age, because we knew their use of social media was really different based on age. If we had to start limiting folks, we'd have to start asking researchers to prioritize the demographic that was most important to them to get feedback on. I think that's the number one thing we would have to do. So instead of getting multiple studios, you might just simply get one studio for that project. But Colleen, can you speak to how our voucher system works?
Sure. So we have CTSA funding allotted to provide vouchers around a variety of areas. So it's basically the CTSA has funding to support reimbursement of participants in paying our studio staff to hold studios. And so investigators go through a request system and can ask for a variety of resources, including community engagement studios, but we also provide resources like some limited pilot funding, use of our clinical research center. We have a translational studio program, biostatistics support, those sorts of things. And so people apply based on the funding level. There are different levels of review. And so if you ask for more pilot funding, you get a more intensive review. And we do try to spread the wealth around. We keep careful data on who's using our system. And we have both junior staff as well as full professors that use it. For the studio program, I would say that I can speak to the translational studio program, which, you know, we have academic experts as opposed to community experts on our panel. We have a lot of junior staff that utilize that extensively. So we kind of front load to support our junior staff. So that's one of the things we think about. We've also added additional criteria in the last few years for review around the project's promotion of diversity and health equity and inclusivity. So there's multiple things that we can consider to start titrating down which studios we would support if we reached a point where there was not enough bandwidth to support all the studios. But I would say Tiffany's absolutely right. We limit, or we could think about limiting on who's been a frequent flyer, who we feel like probably doesn't need to use this as their community mechanism and may want to take the next step in engaging the community that is beyond studios, and reserve those resources for folks that may be new into that space of community engagement, or their project definitely has a unique niche that really requires community feedback before proceeding. A good example is COVID-19. We have lots of people that want COVID-19 studios to engage, as you can imagine, the Black and Brown community to get their opinions on various things about vaccine readiness, those sorts of things. And so at some point, it's making sure that when investigators come to this for those types of studios, that we're really thinking about what questions are we asking, and have we really already asked those before, because we've done several COVID-19 based studies.
I
And
will
if you've asked those questions before, do you send them to talk to the other research team that asked those questions, or do you provide that information?
I'm going to let Tiffany jump in, but my understanding is that we do have a repository of notes that we've collected from studios, and we're able to provide some general guidance and best practices based on the feedback we've gotten in those previous studios. So we don't lock it down so that nobody gets to benefit from that knowledge in the future.
Yeah, I'll give an example, particularly with the Recruitment Innovation Center work that we're doing. And that's something I should mention as a funding possibility for folks across the board. If your institution is applying for large scale grants, the opportunity to have studios to be a part of that system, for instance. So the Recruitment Innovation Center, Precision Medicine Initiative, they all of us included studios in their project. So there are other opportunities to include studios in those really large funding proposals, I think, which is important to remember. And that keeps us going. And I don't think Bree is ever going to have to worry about job security at Utah. They're rock stars. So I thought that was cute. She put that in there. You're never going to have to worry about it. But in terms of utilizing notes, so we've done this for 11 years. We have a couple hundred studios under our belt now. We've got all the notes that are in there in our RedCap database, which you're going to learn more about data from our data wizard, Leah Dunkel, later today. And I can't not stress how valuable and important that data is to whether or not you want to publish with it, learn from it. For the Recruitment Innovation Center, they wanted to do a COVID toolkit. And I worked with our rock star, Julia Dunnigan, who is our social media guru and is over all of the websites, et cetera. We worked together and she worked on the design and the layout and the structure of the toolkit. And I pulled 11 years worth of studio feedback and cataloged it and pulled it into themes, for lack of a better description, on how to create materials and messaging related to particular demographics of groups. And so we color coded it. So if a studio had African Americans all giving their feedback versus Latinx Americans versus over 65 versus essential workers, those were the 4 categories. And we pulled all of the feedback and then nuanced it. So we collapsed it. And if you go through that toolkit, then now researchers will see, oh, if I'm working with a particular demographic, this is the feedback they gave on how to culturally tailor messaging. Oh, if I am, this is the feedback they gave on training up my staff who's doing recruitment. Oh, this is the feedback they gave on websites. So I was really excited about that project because it was like a culmination of 11 years of work that we were able to pull from. And I thought that had significant value because it represented hundreds of people from across the country. So there's lots of really creative and innovative ways I think we can use a lot of the feedback we're getting from community experts for even future projects we don't know about.
And this is Alicia. I am a part of the All of Us project, which actually the community engagement studio model was foundational to writing the engagement core component of this grant, which is a huge research landscape, $1 billion landscape. But the way to really capture the intersectionality of the different populations we want to reach on the All of Us study, and I'm not a part of the recruitment effort. Ours is engagement core, where we embody the value of participants as partners, where the participants actually sit in the governance groups and make decisions, priority set. But in order to really represent the underrepresented biomedical research participants in All of Us, was it 76 community engagement studios you did within a series of months, Tiffany, across the United States, and very thoughtfully?
Yeah, and that was like a huge team effort, I have to say. And with the most wide variety of demographics possible, that's what I thought was so impressive about that initiative with All of Us.
And I do remember you also had some great differently abled groups. I was lucky enough to be a part of those that were visually impaired, and actually a couple members of your team that I was able to join. We went to University of Rochester to the School of the Deaf, and that was the most illuminating community engagement studio ever that I've ever attended for many reasons. So thank you for that opportunity.
No, I love that. It was a huge team effort. There were like dozens of staff who kind of were onboarded to be able to do studios across the country for that one. One of the ones that I was able to do for that one is a group of unhoused men in Nashville. And I think the most profound thing that came out of it for me was I had everyone from folks who did not complete high school to someone with their PhD. And I had 2 people who had worked for Vanderbilt for over a decade. And so it was just a really like eye-opening opportunity. I told you all, every time I do a studio, I walk away like a better person and certainly learning from others' experiences. And that was one of those that really sat with me for a while. And it was a phenomenal studio. It was very informative. But so I guess the thing that is the take home from all of this that I hope everyone is hearing is that there are a lot of creative opportunities at your institutions to fund community engagement studios. It's just about making sure our leadership are aware that this is a resource, that it's valued, that it's something that's used across the country as a national model, and that they can talk with their colleagues about it. Like we can certainly share a list of colleagues across the country that are champions. I think Robin, I think Dr. Dan Cooper is a huge champion of community engagement studios. He always speaks really fondly. And they seem to really enjoy his experience doing them. So I think that there's folks like Dan across the country who could share with their colleagues why they think this is valuable and why they should be including it in their funding proposals. And I'll also say that there are some opportunities for us to collaborate. The folks who are actually implementing the model on the ground, if we could get leadership from buy-in to do a more evaluative study to show, our research showed that the feedback in a community engagement studio is patient-centered, right? Probably not a huge surprise to most of the people in the room, but it showed that our feedback is patient-centered, which can have that impact on proposals and research projects. But what we haven't been able to show definitively via research is that it can in fact improve recruitment. It can in fact improve retention. It can in fact improve the overall experience of research participants. We haven't been able to show that definitively via research. We have that one white paper, right? But that's one little project that we shared yesterday where 100% adherence and 100% retention with those she recruited after her studio. But there are NIH demonstration grants and other grants that we could collaborate on if we had leadership support that would fund studios as well, because the studios would have to be conducted and we would have to have some that didn't have a studio and some that did, and somehow we're able to randomize those in a way where we felt like they were a good comparison of the impact studio feedback had. So I'm just planting little seeds for everyone out there in case there's interest.
Tiffany and team, do you remember the first studio pivot you did when the pandemic hit, 408 days ago? I do remember the STAR CRN, and the acronym eludes me, but this is a PCORI funded project for stakeholders and engagement and technology clinical research network. You did the HERO study, which was a COVID related project. That was a pivot, and that was a virtual studio in May, I think.
It was not our first studio. That was with Dr. Russell Rothman, and that was not our first one. Leah and Devin, correct me if I'm wrong, but our first one was actually with Dr. Paul Harris. And I remember that because I remember thinking Paul had participated in studios before, so I felt like he was a friendly. And so if we were going to pilot something with him via, these remote studios, I was excited that we had some friendlies in the room to pilot it with who would be forgiving if we had flubs, as you said yesterday. So that was our first studio, but our team actually had done remote studios prior to COVID because we were doing rare disease studios. And one of those was for Dr. Dan Cooper that I referenced just a minute ago that works with Robin. We did one with children caregiver dyads who had cystic fibrosis. And I think we used Leah Google Hangouts for that, if I'm not wrong.
I believe we did, yes.
Yeah, Leah did the gracious, she helped us troubleshoot multiple technologies and platforms that were available at that time. We tested it on our own colleagues at work where they all remoted in on Google Hangouts and pretended to be experts so we could walk through everything. And so that was our very first studio. And Leah, do you remember what year that was? Way before COVID.
I want to say it was 2017 or 2018.
Yeah, it was way before COVID. So we already had like a little bit of experience. We knew we had to have at least 3 team members. We knew that we had to do some orientations to the technology. So we kind of had a basic understanding of what we needed to do to do an online studio. But yeah, our first one was actually with Dr. Paul Harris. And Leah, do you remember our exact topic?
I believe it was about integrating electronic medical records with a platform known as Research Match.
Yes. So getting people's feedback on how comfortable they felt, what concerns they would have, what kind of messaging should happen to inform people, those sorts of things. Other thoughts about yesterday's studio? Do y'all have any feedback for us, for our team, or questions about how we were able to pull it off? or questions for your colleagues that you have. You've got access to a lot of folks on here that are doing studios across the country, and we all have like little different nuances to our programs for sure.
Tiffany, this is George. I'm going to jump in.
Yes, please.
I was just going to say, I really, really, really loved the clarity and the precision of your language. I mean, you didn't say more than you needed to say, and you didn't shortchange anyone. It was just very precise and very clear. And I wish I could do that all the time. So it was really very good. Thanks.
Well, thank you, George. You're very kind. I wish I too could do that all of the time. But thank you. That's very kind of you to say. I think I heard somebody else was going to jump in there with George.
It was me. I saw, Heidi, your question about the email we send, or was it, yeah, about the email we send to experts. I just wanted to clarify that's what you were looking for pre-studio.
I just want to know everything you send to the experts before or what they talk about. I get the Zoom orientation, but I just want to know about everything else that you give to them or have them do or review before the studio.
Yeah, I think it depends too, because if you have folks who have been in multiple studios, you could just be like, oh, it's with this person, right? Some of them are just really savvy, whereas some of them you're going to need, they don't know what a CE studio is. They might need help with Zoom. We get some feedback that we're not giving enough information beforehand. A lot of people are good students, right? And they want to review the grant or something beforehand. And it's just that the investigator isn't sharing that sensitive document, right? So trying to give as much information as the research team is comfortable with. So I think I just covered about 3 things. We'll sometimes send like the Zoom tips and tricks if folks are unfamiliar with Zoom, and just some of those group norms. If they have been like any information that the study team can share with us, we'll send out. We had one that they wanted to just review communication, like a newsletter, so a old sample versus a new sample, and having folks compare that. So I hope that makes sense. I gave a lot of information.
It does. And I know Tiffany mentioned sending out the questions beforehand too.
I was going to say, I kind of agree with Megan, and I think Utah does a little different even than the both of us do, but we never send slides ahead of time. That's something we never do, and we've never had that requested before. We do, of course, review and edit slides for the research team to make sure there's no jargon, it's clear, it's concise, it's easy for laymen to understand. I feel like confidently, if I don't understand what medical terms they're using, no one else will. If I'm having to Google things, then it shouldn't be on your slide deck. And so that's one of the pieces. But if we have a high volume of material or something that's more dense that we're going to have to work through, we will send that in advance. If it's a consent document, if it is a survey, if it's a focus group guide, we tend to send those in advance with some prompters for people to think about. So their prompters for yesterday were to walk through the survey and to ask themselves if they thought the question was clear and concise. Did they understand what was being asked of them? Were there any questions that made them or others that they're aware of? As you know, there were several people who had other family members with kidney disease. Were there questions that would make them or others they knew of feel uncomfortable answering? Were there any gaps in knowledge, things that they weren't asking that they felt like were really important and integral to the patient experience? And then if they could set priorities for questions, if they thought certain questions were priorities, and if you were getting rid of anything, please get rid of this one. And I felt like yesterday, based on their feedback, they had all kind of considered those things when we walked through the questions. Now, I will say, if we're giving feedback on materials, when we used to do this in person, I really liked the opportunity to get someone's first impression. You've walked into your doctor's waiting room and you see this flyer. Tell me what your first impressions are. Does it catch your attention? Is there anything that kind of turns you off? Would you pick it up? And if not, how can we work it today together so that you would pick it up? So I like their first impressions about things like flyers. But to Megan's point, if it's a dense amount of information we're going to get through, we'll send that in advance. But we also give some prompters. We do a lot of technology studios now. We've done studios around AI, around a lot of phone apps. Studies are starting to use more text-based and applications for their studies. So we a lot of times will have to set up testing accounts, and we ask the studio experts to go through and test the app. One that was really cool was a resident oncologist who created a pain app via your cell phone, specifically for cancer patients. He had found in his lit review that cancer patients were not reporting increases in pain as frequently as they probably should have, and they felt like that was impacting their ability to heal and have a more positive experience overall in their healthcare. And so he created an app that in the morning and at night, they would just open up the app and they would just pick a smiley face for how they were feeling. And then there was a little free box that they could put a message in if they wanted to. And that immediately went to a dashboard twice a day. And a nurse in the clinic was monitoring the dashboard. And if the nurse started to see a small uptick in pain, then she would report it to the doctor, and then the doctor could communicate to the patient to see what they could do to help alleviate the pain they were experiencing. Because they found that cancer patients time and time again were just suffering, and they didn't want to call, or they were too tired, or there were things going on. And so I thought that was the coolest way. And so we actually had individuals with chronic disease where pain is a major factor join that studio. So some were folks who had been cancer patients, but we also had some other folks who chronic pain was a recurring condition, and they loved it. We had one person who's older who was like, I will invest in this technology if you want to build this out. I will invest in it. It was so cute. So that's just an example of some things we have to send out occasionally.
Perfect. Thank you.
Yeah, Stephen.
Yeah, good morning. Stephen Blakesley from Oregon Health and Science University. Thank you so much for this. This is great. I had a question. You said, I think you mentioned that you spend a fair amount of time, if you're going into a new topic, that you would spend some time researching it to prepare yourself. And it seems like sometimes that might, while beneficial to understand the language, it also moves you away from being completely neutral. And you kind of arm yourself, perhaps, as they say, with just enough information to be dangerous, right? So can you talk a little bit about that, and when you're, where that information sits in the back of your head as you're facilitating?
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the things I want to know before I meet with the research team is how easy or difficult will it be to recruit the particular demographic they've already expressed interest in talking to. So I'd like to know going into the meeting, if they say, we really want to talk with these types of patients, well, do those patients exist? How hard will it be to recruit them? Are they geographically located in certain areas? And an example was a Lyme disease study that came through the Recruitment Innovation Center once. And I was like, interesting, where would we find folks? Like, how could we? And they are actually very concentrated, as well, you live in Oregon, they're very concentrated in certain regions of the country. And so I will do a little reading on who does this disease impact the most? Where are folks located? If there's some regional pieces to that, does it impact a certain demographic of patients more than the others? I'll usually do a quick lit review to see if other studies have had difficulty recruiting certain demographics or populations, because a lot of times if it's an early researcher, I've been surprised to hear that they don't even know the challenges that they may be facing. But if I've read in literature that there's a particular demographic of patients that don't enroll in these studies consistently, we can reference that in the planning meeting and see if that's a group of folks that maybe they should prioritize to reach out to, because they're not being engaged in studies, but they clearly are being impacted by this condition, et cetera. In terms of the other research that I do, I was really speaking more to the norms of a certain group. So for instance, when we were doing the studio with transgender youth, that's a demographic I'd not worked a lot with. I have a wide diversity of friends, but I actually don't have any friends who are transgender. So I started doing some just social media kinds of research and reading some blogs and reading some op-eds and stuff, just to get some pulse on what was happening in that particular community, because I wanted to be educated about it in relation to this particular study, which is genetics. And what I learned really quickly is there are a lot of folks from that community who are very wary of genetic studies related to this particular issue, because they're worried the findings will be used against them. that seemed logical to me, but I'm glad I did some reading so that I kind of had that in my head as we did this studio. That just helped me with some of the nuances associated with it. It also will help me with questions and prompters. If I make note when I read some articles that there are particular symptoms that are more common than others, and that's a focus of our studio, it'll help me develop some prompters. So those are the kinds of things that I'm looking for when I'm trying to prepare myself for a planning meeting with a researcher. Like, I want to know when they mention certain things that I understand what they're saying and what the challenges might be in something. Does that help?
Yeah, so I think that gave me some clarity. It seems like it's more for the preparation as opposed to the facilitation.
Yes, and I am also a big nerd. And so I have like hundreds of research articles cataloged in my bookmarks manager. So anytime we're working on a particular disease or a certain demographic, I have the opportunity to teach a med school class called community healthcare, and they all make fun of me because when someone asks a question in class, I, within like 3 or 4 minutes, can pop 3 current articles in the chat and be like, hey, this is for you. And they'll be like, how do you do that? Where is this information? I'm like, when I can't sleep at night, who else does lit reviews when you can't sleep at night? Anyone? So yeah, I just find that it helps me. I like to.
I'm in that though.
Oh, you know, I think sometimes too, PIs are really surprised when our team goes into a meeting that we can so eloquently speak about the condition that they're researching, and we ask really valid, important questions. I think that instills confidence in the PIs we're working with to do studios. They're like, oh, they know what this condition is. They've clearly done their homework. They're asking the right questions. If I don't do that, I feel like I run the risk of a PI maybe not having confidence in the model, confidence in our team. So I like to walk in there knowing exactly what I'm talking about. Great, wonderful. But that's a great question though. And certainly not an expectation. Bree, Heidi, Jillian, you guys probably don't nerd out like that. And there is really no need for you all to do that. That's just one of my nuances, I think, that's developed over the years. And Stephen, I think it's because I don't come from a research background. I came into this position after being on our advisory council for our community engagement research corps. I worked for an organization. I was the director of programs for community organizing, and I left that position. I actually worked with Yolanda, and I left that position to join Vanderbilt specifically to launch this model. And to create it. And so I think I felt like, they said that imposter syndrome. I felt like I had to, sort of like up my game a little in the research world to feel confident maybe. Other questions or thoughts, feedback about the studio? I was curious if anybody had some recommendations that they would throw out from the studio after you were able to take your notes and sit with it. Did anyone have any recommendations that they would share?
My only recommendations would be for the not for you, well, maybe a little bit for you, but when the PIs or co-PIs, when they were doing their overview, there were some words that they use like prognosis, and I mean maybe everyone in the group already knew those, but I try to just steer away from anything that's not just very simple language. And if someone uses specialized language words, I, as the facilitator, will try to explain that just to make sure everyone knows, oh, I heard this acronym. If I don't know the acronym, I'll ask them to explain it. Or I heard prognosis, just want to let you know this is what they're talking about. So it just seemed a little higher level than plain language in the presentation, but maybe this group was already very familiar with everything because of their medical history.
Yeah, I agree with you 100%. And I honestly don't even remember the use of prognosis. I was probably so nervous that you guys were all listening in. I will say, I do feel like, and Devin and Leah can speak to this was a particularly high health literacy group. And many of them had lived with this condition for a while. And so that's probably why I didn't invest a whole lot of thought into that. But to your point, I think it's really important when any terminology or acronyms are used in studios to pause for a moment and say to the PI, and I usually will say things like, Stephanie, could you explain what that is for a moment? I don't know what that is, or I'm sure everyone in the room probably doesn't. I try to make it so it doesn't look like I think that, the patients in the room don't understand, because I also, there's this fine line between like talking down to people, right? And we have selectively chosen to leave certain terms into slide presentations that we knew were tricky terms, because we thought that the folks in the community engagement studio would benefit from learning what that term was, that was going to be a part of their care, that was going to be a part of these studies. They may hear it later. And we have gotten feedback from experts that, oh, thank you so much. I feel like I know so much more now. I learned so much. So it's this balance of, not overloading people with these terms and acronyms, but also giving them an opportunity and a space to learn what some of these things are so that they can come out as an advocate for themselves and their community. It's, again, just this fine balance, but I agree with you, always explaining those sorts of things. Did you have a recommendation from yesterday, Heidi, that you would recommend to the research team?
Oh, just the only recommendation I had was just that, just like if you catch words like that are being used either by the experts or the clinicians or anybody, just clarifying it. That's really my only recommendation. I thought it was fantastic in every way.
Okay.
Can I touch on that real quick for Heidi? One thing as a facilitator I use, even if I know what those acronyms are, and even if I know what these words are, I always try to play like, this is going to sound bad, but the dumbest person in the room. Right? So I want to feel like, instead of an expert who may not feel like, oh, I don't want to be the only person that says, I don't know what this means. I'm like, I don't know what that means. Like, I will always ask like for clarifying questions so that it really puts the power with the participant. So that's just the technique when some of these words are used. I may just be like, do you mean kidney doctor? If they say nephrologist, or what do you mean by that? So that's just a facilitator.
I noticed Jacqueline put in the box that someone said they called each other doctor, which is a no-no. It is a no-no, and I did notice that. And I don't know if you caught on that I immediately started addressing them by their first names to just level that a little bit. And they're both lovely people. I don't think that they had any intention. I think that they are known for having phenomenal bedside manners. I think it's just that culture that's so intrinsic into the work that they do. But I did notice that. And then you said some concrete action items around food, shopping, and cooking. I agree. I think one of the key recommendations for them is to use existing technologies to provide educational information around the things that you just mentioned. Because I feel like, particularly with COVID, that's going to be an avenue that they need to pursue. And we'll give them a couple of examples of how that they can do that. But that'll be one of the key recommendations for sure. People seemed really receptive to that. So I like.
Yeah, I started, sorry that I was typing into the chat at first. My landscapers were right outside my window. But I started thinking about, there are so many shopping apps and food delivery services. It seems like this is like a niche, I don't know how to say it, population that maybe hospitals could partner with local restaurants, things like that, and kind of get something like this done. I think it would be a huge partnership.
This seems like a phenomenal, if I was an MPH student, or even our med students have in their first year have to do a project, this seems like a phenomenal project for a student that they really could put their name on. I think that would be so great. I also think one of the recommendations is going to be around training of physicians within their own space, the creation of a training around the values and priorities of patients and how they can better communicate that. I think that's really important. I heard from multiple people that they weren't getting that. And then for the people who were getting it, how valuable it was. So hopefully they'll consider doing their own internal training. So we'll certainly recommend that.
I'm going to jump in because we are at time for this session. And I think we have a break until 11:45. But before everyone runs off, we have our professional Zoom photographer, Matt, who's going to do our headshots. So Alicia, if you could stop sharing the screen. Everyone get your best Zoom face on. If you can handle it, put your camera on. I guess I should put my camera on. And then Matt, you go ahead and take a couple of shots and let us know when you're done so then folks can run out for their break.
Come on, where's Ed? Ed's back.
Got my headset hair going.
Oh, I'm
You're
sure.
lovely, Colleen, looking lovely.
Great backdrops too.
Where are you, Alicia?
Well, with this, I'm camera ready, but you know, with this setup, I can't show I don't have a camera, but I am camera ready.
Darn it.
Oh, we gotta get you in here, Alicia.
Alicia, come on over here. Put your mask on,
Hi, Dr. Kim.
please.
Are we doing a countdown?
So we're
Matt's in
missing
charge.
Daniel.
Okay,
Daniel
so I'm just smiling like this, and I don't know if I should stop.
Yeah, we'll have to scroll through because we got a few pages. That's right, Bree.
Ed walked away.
Oh, there's Alicia.
Where did Ed go?
Ed just walked away.
Want me to text Ed?
Yeah, come on, Ed.
I also need feedback from Matt when we're done here.
Right. Is Matt gonna let us know when we're done?
Wait, Ratty. I gave him your 80. Oh,
Social.
576.
Ed, don't tell us your
86.
social.
Oops, sorry.
Goodness.
We were all about to go shopping on Ed. All right, Colleen, who's counting down?
So I've got Alicia
Is
check-in.
Matt
Matt's
on
been
the phone?
scrolling through the pages looking for everybody taking pictures. So hopefully got a couple of everybody. So she's gonna come back and tell us when Matt got what Matt did. What were we paying Matt for?
I'm with Leah. Or Devin. This is
5
not-
more minutes. That's what we've been told.
No,
I still see Devin working really hard.
that's a long time.
He's doing individual grabs. I hope he got Alicia and I because we're not hugging again.
I can come in. We can do a little hug.
No, we're not
group
doing
huddle.
a three-way hug. That's entirely too much.
Should we do masks to capture the time? If anyone has a mask they want to put on,
This
we'll
Zoom-
know it was in 2020 or 2021.
I feel like Zoom captures.
Yeah, Zoom is the time.
I'm going to put mine on because I think we're all going to still be Zooming after this, so we won't know.
Hey, can I ask Steve? You started to put your hand up when Colleen called for a break. Steve, did you have a question while we're waiting anyway?
Oh yeah, I was just typing it into the chat. Excuse me. So you keep searching for comments for the facilitator, so I'm going to go for it.
Yeah, please.
I think one of the experts at one point said, and I don't remember the exact detail, but the comment was how it impacted them day to day. And as a facilitator, I would have jumped on that because when you talk about day to day, that triggers people's individual stories and it puts them in a certain place and a certain mindset, which would then trigger other thoughts and reactions. And so I had written that down as a point in time to really try to dive in a little bit more.
Yeah. When I go back and listen to the recording now, you know I'll obsess about that.
Just don't let it keep you up at night.
Thank you for that feedback. And I agree, like 100%. That is a great opportunity. Yeah.
And then I had a question too. I was surprised at one point you started making suggestions of actions to take. And as a facilitator, I was, for you being the facilitator, I was surprised that you were doing that.
Yeah, so a couple of scenarios yesterday. One was our incredibly short time span. I wanted to get feedback on the feasibility of a couple of things that we had heard in other studios to see if it vibed with that group or not. So when I asked them, like, would YouTube videos be something that you would even use? Is that something that, or would you appreciate getting XYZ from your doctor, or would that not have value? So that was one of the things I was trying to prompt them to see, was it even going to be feasible or realistic? Because I didn't want to include things in our recommendations about how to disseminate information and reach patients if it wasn't really something patient groups weren't going to be interested in. So that was one of the pieces of things that I was doing. And I feel like there was another point where they had asked a question and I tried to pull in stuff from some other studios that we had heard to get their feedback. And I apologize, I'm blanking. Do you have in your notes one of the other places where I gave recommendations?
I was looking, I didn't find it, and I realized that it's in the chat somewhere.
Okay, I'll look back through the chat.
But I don't know if I can't be certain that it references the exact subject at that point in time.
Yeah, there was definitely one other area where I gave feedback from something we had heard in another studio, and I cannot remember what it was. I definitely think that the shortened time span made me feel more rushed. I was so mindful that we were supposed to jump back in the Zoom with you guys that I felt like by the last 10 minutes, I was like, okay, we got to go. We got to go. I definitely felt
about
that.
meals and meals and how to prep and how to shop.
Yes, yes. I was trying to play a little bit off of a lot of the feedback that we got from Marcus and then Richard saying he doesn't want to eat chicken anymore. And we have literally heard that in other studios from people. I don't want to eat another piece of chicken. So that really was funny. That resonated with me because it was so emphatic in a couple of other studios. How are we doing, Colleen?
Let's just go with it. I think everyone needs a bit of a break real quick before we start the next session.
Perfect.
So everyone want to take a 5-minute bio break and then we'll jump back in. I think is Leah next with a scintillating discussion on data tracking.
The exciting world of data that all of our lives are built around.
I'm a basic scientist. Do not knock the data.
It's going to be so fun, guys. So fun.
It's our favorite thing.
It's our
All right, see everyone in 5 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you.
Perfect. So welcome back, everyone. Just to keep our minds awake, we have another poll. So this is Now That's a Cool Project for 600. What was one of the most interesting research projects a CES has given feedback on? And I'll give everyone just a second to answer.
I think people are still coming back because no one's responded yet. So might have to give a little bit longer.
Perfectly fine. I realized I did not know the answer to my own poll question. So I am going to look up the answer now.
No, you do know the answer to this one. Read the answers. You know the answer to this. And if this will show us who was paying attention in our training.
For those who are just coming back from a break, we are starting off with a poll. So when you can, just go ahead and answer the question that you see on screen.
So maybe give it another 30 seconds and then we'll go ahead and show the answers.
Perfect. Thanks, Colleen. Okay, so it looks like most folks did get this one right. So as Tiffany said, this was a project that we mentioned it a couple of times during this training. So this is a longitudinal study that was looking at the genomics of gender diversity for an international genetics consortium that was done with transgender identifying youth. I sadly was not there for this studio, but I have heard a lot about it. Tiffany, anything you want to mention about that studio specifically?
No, it just was one of my favorite studios. I love that studio. The researcher was so open and was really excited and impressed with the feedback the youth gave. And it was the first studio I think that we had done with youth, which is something we're really pushing our institution to understand, is that youth also have a voice and they should be able to share about their healthcare journeys. It was a little tricky at first because this is an example of a flub, Leah, that we discovered in our system. So compensating the youth and actually even doing the studio with youth were these like conversations that had to be had within our institution because they were minors. So we actually ended up working through a community organization that coordinated that element of it. And then in terms of compensation, they did not use their dead name on their paperwork. Which from a legality standpoint, our institution was like, oh, well, we can't pay them because this name doesn't legally exist. And so we had to go through this whole rigmarole of getting the paperwork redone and getting the youth compensated. And it took way longer than we wanted to. So that was a learning process for us. Every studio, we learned something new. And compensating internationally. So we were set to do a studio actually in Sweden recently. We have not done an international studio yet, Heidi, but we were set to do one in Sweden, actually with a similar demographic, but adults, interestingly enough, but for an entirely different project. That compensation was going to have to come via that PI. So they were going to have to pay the compensation themselves. We don't have a mechanism to compensate folks who live outside of the US. Leah, tell me if I'm wrong.
No, that's correct. That's our process for folks. If we do a studio internationally, it will come through that studies budget for that reason.
Well done, though. 32% of you were like, I remember talking about this.
I was going to say, or maybe they're just not interested in the same things we are. We have different interests. A subjective question. Okay, so we're going to get started with going through some of our CE Studio data. So these are data that are across our institutions. Thank you to our wonderful colleagues from the University of Utah and the University of Michigan who pulled a lot of this information. Colleen, or Alicia, you can go to the next slide. So we have several databases. I will say this is VUMC specific. I think University of Utah and Michigan have similar databases, and Bree and Megan, please feel free to speak up. But I'm not going to go into too much detail of these because we'll share the data dictionaries for these databases with you after the training. But just suffice to say that our CES database is our main database that contains all of our studio information. So this will include information like the PI's name, the expert names, the PowerPoint, the summary. So all of those things that if we need to look back on a studio, we'll be able to do that in that database. Then our expert application feeds into our large expert database of about, I think at this point, 600 people who participated in studios and who would be interested in being contacted again. So if we're looking for experts, a lot of times we'll go there. And then we have separate researcher evaluation and expert evaluation databases. And that's largely because those evaluations are asking somewhat different questions. So we have those separated out. You can go on to the next slide, Alicia. So to provide a brief overview of sort of the primary focus of our CE studios, and this is across time, so not within a specific date range, just from beginning of the studio program up till probably, at least for us, about a month ago. And what you'll see is that for across our institutions, recruitment strategies are number one. So whether that's specifically looking at how to recruit, where to recruit, or also material review can fall into that as well. And I think that's very reflective of what we see as an issue in clinical trials. Many of them still aren't meeting their recruitment goals. And so a lot of times trials do come to us sort of midway through and say, oh, I'm having recruitment trouble. As much as possible, we're trying to focus on the early phases. So maybe before they've even put in a proposal or as they're developing a recruitment plan, then if they do a studio, they can get ahead of a lot of those barriers so that they can address them as a part of their recruitment plan. I love to see on Michigan's, or I love to see that consent was another big thing that folks are looking at, because that's one of the places where I know we've seen studios have a really great impact. Sometimes in studios, if we pull up the consent, we'll have the researcher sitting there and the community experts will say, oh, I don't understand what any of this means. Or, and we had a recent studio where in looking through a consent document, the researchers realized that the consent was turning people off the project because just of it was a wording issue where people just were misinterpreting, it wasn't clear and the meaning was being completely misinterpreted. You can go on to the next slide. So these are our self-reported gender statistics across our institution. As with many sort of databases, we do sway predominantly female. I will say that that's something we're trying to actively address. So being sure that we have, I think yesterday was one of our more male-dominated studios. Usually we do have more women than men in our studios or folks identifying as women, but we're trying to really seek out men to participate in our studios. We actually had a recent studio where we weren't able to find any men to participate on a pediatric project. So I think I've talked about this project before. And we had one of our community experts say, well, I want to be sure that you're including the perspectives of men because, a lot of them are also going to doctor's appointments with their kids. And so you need to be sure to include their opinions. And, it was poignant and we wished we'd really been able to include that perspective and encourage the researcher to sort of seek out other mechanisms, either do another studio where we specifically focus on recruiting that demographic or find some other mechanisms to get that feedback. As Tiffany mentioned, we've sort of adjusted our gender focus or our gender self-descriptions over time. So our screening surveys, which I think Bree talked about yesterday, now include a wide range of gender identities. So again, we're letting folks self-report. That's another place where we sort of have I prefer not to answer this. If they say I prefer not to answer this, we do ask folks, and we have started asking folks for their gender pronouns just so that we know how to appropriately address them on the phone when we call. And so that's something we're, continuously striving to be as inclusive as we possibly can. And we've gotten some good feedback, especially from our recent studios where we've had a wide range of folks with different gender identities in our studios. You can go on to the next slide. Alicia? Oh, perfect. Here, I just really wanted to highlight that the folks who are in our studios are reflective of the populations that researchers are looking to hear from. We are bound in an extent to who folks are wanting to hear from. And a lot of times, at least for us at VUMC, researchers will say, well, I want to hear from Vanderbilt patients. And Vanderbilt patients do tend to be predominantly white. Now, I will say that we sort of try to push back on this. As you saw yesterday, we sort of over-recruited from a diverse range of patients. So we're being sure that we're including those voices, but this is reflective of our database and Michigan's and Utah's as well. Bree or Megan, I'm not sure if there's anything that either of you want to add on this slide.
Yeah, I'd just like to add that for us, this information is self-reported. So if someone chooses not to share their race or ethnicity with us, that might impact some of these numbers. And, just to note that this is over years of studios and that many of our current studios are with these diverse communities. So initially they might have been with a certain population and then over time we just haven't caught up with those, if that makes sense.
Bree, I think we're losing you a little bit. Your audio is a little bit, or maybe that's just on my end, but I think I got at least everything that you were saying. Okay, Megan, anything you wanted to add?
Yeah, I was going to actually add, since we're relatively new to this, still to the studios, for me pulling this data was really reflective. We have a really big Middle Eastern North African population in Southwest Michigan. So for me to see that number so low, it's good for us to strategize, like you were saying before, when you looked at your numbers, what kind of different outreach could we be doing to different populations. So that this has been helpful. So I would suggest revisiting this data every once in a while to see if there's folks you're missing.
And I see that Sarah had a comment that I do want to highlight. She mentioned that if we're looking at these data for projects focused on both men and women, you're right, Sarah, we actually do get a fair number of studios that are specifically focused on women's health. So that probably doesn't completely explain, the whole disparity, but I do think it's something that is very true of our studios. We do have quite a few that come through where they're looking pretty exclusively for us to bring in the perspectives of folks who identify as women. Alicia, you can go on to the next slide. So here I just really wanted to highlight the great diversity of folks who are coming in for studios. These are sort of some of the top disciplines of researchers requesting a studio. What we see at Vanderbilt a lot of times is that once one person from a specific department does a studio, like for example, cardiology or emergency medicine, we see a huge influx just through word of mouth. That person does a studio and says, hey, here's this great program. And very thankfully, we're very blessed that they recommend it to their colleagues. And then we get a whole host of studios from that particular group, but also to highlight, that it's not limited just to specific academic disciplines. The University of Utah, as Tiffany mentioned, has done studios for emergency dispatch. I know Michigan worked with their community needs assessment. So the model is so flexible that we believe it can be adapted to really fit any discipline or need where you're needing to bring in community members for feedback. Alicia, you can go on to the next slide. For our researcher characteristics, a lot of times when we're doing presentations on studios, the assumption is that most of the folks coming through are early career researchers, so folks who are fellows or postdocs, grad students. And while we do see a fair amount of that, the majority of folks coming through our studio programs are assistant professors or professors. So just one of those stereotypes that we hear a lot, but it's full tenured professors who are participating in these studios. Move on to the next slide. This is something we're pretty proud of. So this is something from our researcher evaluation. One of the questions that they're asked to agree with is the input provided by the community experts will improve the quality of the research. And we have, it's at 99% or very, very close to 100 of folks who are either agreeing or strongly agreeing with this statement. And so we feel that's really important, again, for researchers, especially who have very limited interactions with community members. This may be the first time they've ever really even heard from patients. And so it's really important that they are coming out of that experience, really valuing the input that community members have given during the session. You can go on to the next slide. I think this is my final slide, and finally, this is a graph comparing two of the metrics, one on our community member evaluation and one on our researcher evaluation, talking about what the community experts contributed to the project. And I think this one is really interesting, especially in terms of providing feedback on the appropriateness of the project and ideas on recruiting research subjects. So for a lot of these, the green is our researchers and blue is our community members. You'll see that the researchers had a higher percentage of agreement that saying that the community members really contributed to this project. So they sort of have a higher perception of the, not worth, but value of that input and the appropriateness of that input than even our community members did. So I think that, reflects, as I think we've all talked about during this training, that power imbalance where maybe community members are still feeling like their input isn't valued as much, or, maybe our researchers are just coming away with this, their minds blown, I think, as Tiffany said. But either way, I think it's really interesting to see that researchers are reporting that or have a higher rate of reporting that community members are contributing to these different facets of the project. And I think we had a question. Bree has just noted that they're in the process of hiring a data analyst to collect and track the evaluative information. Thanks for that, Bree. And so, go ahead, Tiffany.
Did you hear that, Colleen? Utah is in the process of hiring a data analysis.
I did hear that. I shall take it up with the powers that be.
It's been recorded.
It's because we don't have time. I mean, with so many sessions and two of us that are just going, this falls to the wayside, right? It's such important information and we've just not been able to keep on top of it. So
yeah, I 100% agree. And I feel like because we work in these academic medical centers that this data is gold. Like I said, being able to pull 11 years worth of data to inform a COVID toolkit, I thought was really innovative and something that a lot of sites wouldn't have the ability to do. So I agree with you. I think the data is really, really important. Even though Colleen knows that I do not like writing academic papers, I 100% recognize the value and the importance of it.
And so for this last slide, I just wanted to ask Bree and Megan to talk through sort of how they've adapted the studio model in terms of, co-facilitating with community members, using the studio for community needs assessment, and working with interpreters. So Bree, I don't know if I can hand it off to you.
I don't know how much you want to know about our adaptation. We've made several over the years, and the primary reason for a lot of our adaptations is to not only meet the needs of researchers and community members, but also as we do need to run ours as a business, as a service recharge center. So we've had to be creative with how to sell the studios as something that can be used at any time for any purpose by anyone. So some of the adaptations we've made, as Ed mentioned, was co-facilitation with community members through building those community networks, utilizing these as ways to understand a community instead of understand a community's perspective on a research study, but just to understand a community itself and perspectives on certain topics. One example is we are still working on now, like the third phase of a project with a PI who just wanted to understand different communities' perspectives on mental health and their needs within that community and resources and how they feel about talking about mental health. And so that's been really helpful because it's now resulted in that PI connecting with these community leaders to implement some mental health supports within those communities. And then working with interpreters, we recommend that when working with certain communities, and we have some great community interpreters that we bring on board to either interpret for the group if it's multilingual, or sometimes just on the phone with the facilitator or the PI to translate what's happening if we're conducting a session in a completely different language. So those are some of the adaptations we've made, as well as just making this into a business model for us at our new CTSI. We're now a CTSI, so that's really exciting for us.
And I can just jump in really quickly to say that we worked with a local health system. I'm not sure, probably everybody knows that health systems that are nonprofit have to go through a community health needs assessment every 3 or 5 years. I can't remember exactly. I think it's 3, to make sure that they're serving the community. And just given with everything happening with COVID, they usually have, there's steps in the process where they do a survey and then they do the focus groups. And we just so happened to connect with the folks from the health system, and it's not our health system, it's St. Joe's Mercy. And we were just sort of talking around recruiting for CE studios, and they're like, what's the CE studio? So we were able to work with them to do about 6 sessions and recruited from their population and our population together. So that was a really nice way to collaborate, to do this as a studio around the needs assessment.
And I see we have a question in the chat. I was just about to ask if anyone had any questions, asking to describe the type of language interpretation. So I can at least speak for us when we've used interpreters. We have done, for the studio with Arabic speaking families, we did consecutive interpretation. If I think I'm understanding this correctly. So the interpreter was speaking in Arabic to our community experts and then back translating to me as the facilitator and to the research team. And then when the research team and I spoke, he was then interpreting to the folks who were acting as our community experts. We've also done sort of, I think, simultaneous interpretation where not so much interpretation, but we had a facilitator who was speaking the same language as our community experts. And I think I typed something about this in the chat yesterday, some feedback that he gave us, and he was wonderful and from the University of New Mexico. So thank you, Heidi, for your help with that. But he pointed out to us that it really is not feasible for the facilitator to also act as an interpreter, because that was just too much for one person to do. It wasn't, when the research team did not speak the language. So he was having to interpret what the community experts were saying for the research team, and then also sort of interpret their questions back to the community experts. And he just said it was too much. So if we move forward with doing that again in the future, there needed to be a dedicated interpreter to work with the research team solely, so that the facilitator could just focus on facilitating. I know Bree or Megan, if either of you would like to say anything, and Heidi, I see you have your hand raised as well.
I just wanted to add on to what you were saying about Jesus, my colleague that did the studio in Spanish. He also has done focus groups in Spanish and highly recommends not having mixed languages in the same group. It is just way too hard for everyone to just have a really deep, rich conversation with each other if everyone's speaking different languages and there's an interpreter talking above or around other people. It just makes it really difficult. So just wanted to add that too.
Yeah, I would say it definitely slows things down. Yeah, when you've got, and Brianna, I see that you noted that as well, where if you're doing, even more than one language, it is slowing things down substantially and can sort of decrease the depth that you're able to get to. The studio that we did with the Arabic speaking families was a pretty high level, or I guess not a particularly emotional topic, and that we were just talking about telehealth. So looking at some materials to help folks access telehealth. So I think it went all right, but I think if we'd been talking about anything that was potentially more emotional, it would have been much more of a challenge to sort of work in that space when we're speaking two different languages. I think Carmen, you had your hand raised first.
Yes. I just wanted to say that I agree with the recommendation of if possible, to have the activity in the language of the people that are there, because also sometimes we're working with populations that have been vulnerabilized socially, and so there is a mistrust. And when there's someone that is not from their group translating, there is a certain, there isn't as much as freedom that could be if they're all understanding and knowing where the others are coming from and understanding, especially the facilitators.
Totally agree. And Elizabeth, you have your hand raised as well.
Yeah, hi. So I just had a question. Are the scenarios that you're describing here, were those on Zoom virtual studios, or were those in person? And then a comment, we're about to launch something on Zoom with simultaneous interpreters, because, and it's not a studio, it's a public health education, but it's simultaneous interpretation because the target audience is older Vietnamese monolingual adults and their caregivers, many of whom are more comfortable in English because they were born and raised here or what have you. But I think the real importance is going to be the simultaneous interpretation. But I guess a question that arises for me is, what do you do with scribing in a studio, in a community engagement studio environment in that instance? If you were to have two different languages in a room with either consecutive or simultaneous interpretation, how do you handle the scribing? Do you have two scribes, one in language A and one in language B, or, it's complicated.
I can only speak from our experience, and I'm really interested if other folks on the call have other experience. And Ricardo, I'd love for you to unmute yourself and speak up as well. But for the studio where we worked with an interpreter, but the facilitator and researchers spoke English, the scribe scribed in English based on that consecutive interpretation, and then had the interpreter watch back through the studio and read the notes to ensure that all the comments were captured appropriately. For the studio that was conducted in the language that the experts were speaking, we hired a community scribe who also was Spanish speaking. So she took notes in Spanish and then worked with an interpreter to help translate those into English for the research team. But I don't know, Ricardo, do you have anything that you'd like to add or speak up? Because I feel like you have a lot of experience here.
Yeah, no, that was excellent that you provided that example, Leah, because that's really what the ideal is. I mean, the thing that I mentioned in the comment here is, as an interpreter myself, it takes a lot of brain power. And so it is recommended that for sessions that are an hour, that you have 2 interpreters that can tag team. If it's 2 hours, then they can also switch back and forth, but it usually, it's usually how we do community events here at the Dell Medical School, is that, you know, an interpreter will do 30 minutes, take a 30-minute break, and the other one will jump in. And so it's just something to consider, right? Because even for budget reasons, having a scribe as well to be able to review that. And a lot of times, depending on how technical the jargon can be, we might be looking at someone with medical kind of experience translating, which is a whole different category of translation and interpretation. So yeah, just putting all those things out there. The other thing that I also appreciate that was mentioned is the extra time, because it really does take a little bit of time. And just on an operational level, we trained our researchers and participants to speak very, very slowly when you're dealing with translation services, which in different sessions can be very difficult for folks that are fast speakers and just tend to really go off and speak really quickly. So it also, I would say, is an element of training for researchers and participants to really be able to speak slowly in consideration of simultaneous translation. Thanks.
Devin, I'm not sure if you have anything else that you want to add. Devin worked with our Arabic interpreter to do a lot of the Zoom orientations and working with our community experts. Devin, anything you want to add?
What was that? No, just that it was definitely a learning experience for me, and that I just have the biggest respect for our interpreters and the translators, but nothing specific to add other than what you said, Leah.
I should say, to your point, Ricardo, we did work with someone from medical translation services. So I think a lot of what he was doing was already in some sense a part of his job. He actually knew some of our community experts, and because he'd helped with and worked with them in the past. So I think that was helpful. And then having those, he was on all of our Zoom orientations. So he had the opportunity to meet and talk with people in advance.
Can I add to that? I think
Yeah, go ahead.
Also one tip for interpreters is getting them the information really early on, so that they're familiar with the study, they're familiar with the questions and the summary, so that they know what they're talking about. So if they need to say it in a different way, they know how to reword that appropriately, instead of doing a word for word interpretation or translation. So having them involved in those consultations with the researchers is helpful, giving them as much time and information with the questions and summary is recommended.
I will add, and I don't know if this has been said already, that to your point, Bree, we did gave our interpreters the opportunity to sit in on community engagement studios before the studio that they would be hired in to do the interpretation, just so they would be familiar with the model and the concept. So I just wanted to add that.
I think, Elizabeth, you have your hand raised.
Yes, just a quick question. When you have had dual language studios, if the experts are speakers of more than 2 languages, and I know you're counseling against this, I'm wondering how you've handled the slides. Have you had slides with, in English and the other language, or, yeah, because that presents a challenge, I think.
think I'll have to turn this question over to Brianne, because I think Brianne's the only one who has done this, unless there are others in the group who have, but we have not done a studio where folks were speaking more than one language, aside from people who were bilingual and so spoke English and whatever language the studio was being conducted in.
Yeah, Liz, this kind of just is an adaptation of our model, is that we actually don't have slides. We have a verbal presentation from the researcher. So that kind of solves that issue for us because we're able to translate that.
Thank you.
Now we're close to time, but does anyone else have any other questions about adapting the studio model, other things that you want to discuss?
This is Alicia. I would like to bring up, and we talked about it earlier with the 76 studios that you all did. Again, I was able to have the privilege to work with the ASL, deaf and hard of hearing community. So has anybody have any tips or tricks in that domain? One that I learned on the fly, which was a humbling moment for me, do not look at the interpreter that is signing to the individuals while they're participating in the studio. That's one thing I learned on the spot.
Hi, this is Yolanda. I had the opportunity to work with the deaf and hard of hearing community through several, both studios and some community listening sessions. And what we did was went to the organization and had them train our staff on how to be attentive and to pay attention and to work with the interpreter. So it took a little extra time, took about an hour out of our pre-prep work. But if possible, I would suggest bringing in an American language signing trainer and have them train the facilitators on how to work with the group so that you can avoid things just like that, not remembering not to look at the interpreter,
right.
Pay attention to the facilitator, to the group. And there were some other nuances, such as to speak slowly, to be mindful of, I gesture a lot, so I had to be mindful and refrain. Just because sometimes the gestures that I might make and not be aware of might be offensive to the participants. So, I just had to remember some of those things. So if you're not familiar with the group, I would suggest reaching out and having one of their professionals come in and train you on how to do that.
Alicia, I put in the chat something that I learned through a different studio that was not with that particular patient population, but that Black American Sign Language is actually different and that there's variations of American Sign Language. And I did not know that. So I thought that that was something really valuable to carry forward in our work as well.
That is very helpful. And I do remember at this population I was talking about earlier that even those that had cochlear implants took them out so that they could all be in the same ability as far as responding to ASL.
Wow.
And Elizabeth, I saw your question about using closed captioning. I think from folks who've spoken earlier, it sounds like the Zoom closed captioning does work to an extent, but isn't perfect and misses a lot of words. I'm sorry, I'm forgetting who talked about using that before, but it sounded like someone had some experience using Zoom closed captioning.
I've used it just for meetings. And yeah, it's better than nothing. It's, I think, more helpful for people who are hard of hearing versus deaf. And it does, yeah, it's not great, but it's good enough. Yeah.
I think we are just closing up because I know we are right at time. Does anyone have any sort of last minute questions or thoughts they want to share?
This is Karen DeLulio at UMass. Just to add a little bit more to the Zoom meeting, actually, I just conducted a webinar this morning and we hired a CART person, a captionist, and they kept up with it and you could just do the closed captioning. And that way I find that you're always making eye contact and you let the person you hire deal with typing everything in. And boy, are they fast. They can type so fast. And the people that attended were very grateful for that because it didn't even feel like there was a disruption.
That's a great idea. I know we've had folks do that for large webinars where they have folks attending who speak multiple different languages. So they've used that in terms of just closed captioning in other languages and hired captionists.
We've hired Spanish speaking individuals as well. But my question for you is, because it's a community engagement studio and people could share things, is there something specific that those interpreters should do prior to logging in? And I mean, they're going to be hearing information from people.
The only time I will say that we've worked with an interpreter, again, it was a medical interpreter. So he works for our institution and, is commonly helping people at doctor's visits. So I think we weren't as concerned about him, sharing anything in a way that he shouldn't. But I think if we are bringing in outside folks, especially people we have no experience with, the other individual we hired was someone who's attended multiple community engagement studios who we know and have worked closely with. But I think we would be hesitant in some cases if we're just bringing in other folks.
Right.
Yeah, Leah, just to tag on to that, I mean, we're fortunate that we work with our IRB to develop community-friendly city training so that they're not the 8-hour online trainings. They're more of a collaborative discussion and practical application of city training and HIPAA training. And so we're fortunate when we can work with those individuals. Otherwise, we treat them as an expert, right? And when we deal with our community experts, we're saying, we're going to share some really personal stuff in this conversation, and what's said in this room or in the Zoom stays here. And just we ask that you be respectful and mindful of that. So we're putting some faith out there and some confidence, just like we would with our community experts, to not share these personal.
Thanks, Bree. And we have a community-friendly city training as well. I should have mentioned that I know Tiffany and Yvonne helped develop. All right, so I think it is time for us to go on break. I'm going to hand it back to Alicia and Colleen.
Thanks, Leah. All right, so a couple housekeeping notes. We're on break from 12:30 to 1. We will keep this room open if people want to engage in a chat, and if we have multiple conversations that people want to have on different topics, we let us know and we can set up a couple different chat rooms. A couple other pieces of information. For those of you that joined the call later today, we have a guy, Matt, on our team who has been taking headshots for people who agreed to the photo release. He'll be happy to take a few headshots for later if you want to stick around a little bit during lunch and have your camera on. If not, go enjoy your lunch. And then I'll give you a couple housekeeping things. We're going to start at 1 o'clock promptly, 1 o'clock Central Time with our panel. We ask in one of those rare community engagement moments, when you come back, if you are not on the panel, can you please turn your cameras off? We want to focus strictly on the panelists and highlight them and their experiences. Additionally, if you have questions during the panel, go ahead and you can chat me or you can chat Alicia, and we'll make sure that Dr. Kim, who's going to be facilitating the session, gets that information so she can make sure that we get through as much information from the panelists, but also field as many questions as possible. Thank you. See you at 1 o'clock.
All right, it is 1 o'clock, so we'll go ahead and get started with our expert panel. Sarah, I see you're on the call, but if you put there you go. And hopefully all the panelists with their cameras on, and once they start talking, we'll get to the top of the screen for everyone. And I will let Dr. Kim take it away for us, who's going to be leading our panel today.
Well, good afternoon, everybody. First, I'm Dr. Kimberly White-Jethridge, and it is my pleasure to have the opportunity to moderate this, this panel. I hope you all have been enjoying the cross-pollination and conversation that's been going on throughout the meeting. It has been so amazingly invigorating to share it with all of y'all. And this is going to be a opportunity to continue the conversation just in a little bit more of a structured way. So with that, just a couple of comments about the panel as we move forward. One is that unfortunately we have a limited amount of time, and I want to make sure that we get through as many of the questions and give everybody the opportunity to speak, which means that we're going to have to cut you off possibly if you keep talking. So I'll do it nicely, but I do ask that you are respectful of the time so that everyone has the opportunity to speak and we can get as much information out as possible. And that does mean that as a possible, we might not get to all of the questions or everybody's comments. And if that is the case, we'll make sure that whatever questions still remain are answered and everyone has access to that information. I'm going to take an opportunity to formally introduce all of the speakers so that you know who is going to be on the panel, and then we'll start going through some of the questions. So I'm going to start, and as you see, the speakers will be have their cameras on so that you can identify the face with their short little bios. So first, I'd like to introduce Ms. Stacy Clark, who works with the Sickle Cell Foundation of Tennessee and has been a community expert in 6 community engagement studios at Vanderbilt since 2014. And these studios has helped inform patient engagement focusing on sickle cell care, identifying needed mammography services for women, informing messaging and material, as well as recruitment for COVID-19 clinical trials, and more. Many of these studios have focused on ways to increase research participation from traditionally underrepresented and underserved communities. And Stacy feels that participating in these studios allows researchers the opportunity to better understand these communities. Okay. Next, Ms. Patricia Hall. And Ms. Hall has participated as a community expert in 2 community engagement studios at the University of Michigan over the past 6 months. Ms. Hall has been a community expert in 3 community engagement studios, providing feedback on topics such as community engagement through precision medicine, improving health outcomes from traumatic brain injuries, and more. And much of the focus of these studies has been on increasing recruitment and retention. Through her participation in these studios, Patricia feels she has a voice in how studies are performed and that she is being heard. And our third community member is Ms. Fahina Tavaki Pasi, who is the executive director of the National Tongan American Society in Salt Lake City, Utah. And Fahina has been a community expert in 9 community engagement studios, providing feedback on topics such as women's health, support for Alzheimer's caregivers, emergency dispatch services, diabetes prevention programs, data sharing, and consent, mental health, and of course, COVID-19. Through her participation in studios, she has seen the importance of including community voices in research about that community and the need for organizations to build that bridge between researchers and the community, and the importance of reporting research findings back to the community. We also have 3 researchers on the panel. The first is Dr. Derek Griffith, who is a professor and director of the Center for Men's Health Research at Vanderbilt University, at least until the summer, at which point he will be transitioning to Georgetown University as co-director of the Racial Justice Institute. He studies why health varies by race, ethnicity, and gender, and what can be done to give people equal opportunities to be healthy. Dr. Griffith has led 5 community engagement studios since 2015, and the research projects have centered around African-American men's health, and the studios have had a focus on messaging, community outreach, recruitment and retention, and dissemination. Dr. Sarah Simonson is an associate professor in women's and reproductive health at the University of Utah. Her research has focused on motivating women to participate in diabetes prevention, approaches to help women think about the impact of their health before and in between pregnancies, and on pregnancy outcomes, and the impact of obesity during the reproductive years as it relates to infertility. Dr. Simonson has held 7 community engagement studios for 3 research projects with a focus on women's health. And finally, Ms. Rachel Dawson, who serves as the Managing Director of Precision Health at the University of Michigan. She works with faculty co-directors to shape strategy, implement programs, and develop resources for researchers across campus. Precision health facilities research, across disciplines and on a variety of topics from cancer to mental health to metabolic diseases and more. Precision Health at the University of Michigan has conducted 4 community engagement studios with a focus on engaging communities as partners, use of de-identified health data for research, and with messaging. So with these esteemed guests, the information that's going to come and the knowledge and experience with studios will be priceless. And again, we're going to try to get through as many questions. So we'll spend about 7 minutes or so on each question. And as we move forward, the first question, if you could describe your experience with studios and the impact they have had for you. And I'm going to open that up to the panelists to see if I get a bite. Otherwise, I'm going to call on someone.
I'll bite.
Thank you.
Describe my experience with studios and the impact on me. Precision Health, the reason why we decided to do these studios, standing advisory committees are a great approach to getting information and engaging your community, but you have a static set of people that you always hear from. And we don't necessarily feel that that is great representation of the large community that we serve. And because of the nature of what we do, we needed to hear from more of our participants to get their feedback and to really appreciate the trends across, were there trends across types of participants or hearing from individuals. And so our experience with the studios is that it's allowed us to reach more people. We've heard different perspectives, and it's really helped us understand how the participants in our studies like to be communicated with. And so they've really enhanced communication, but also from a researcher perspective, opened our eyes to some of those stereotypes. You know, we look at research, we form beliefs based on that research. And then I think it impacts how we approach the community. So these studios have really changed how we think of our participants, how we approach our participants, and has set us from a mindset of these are people that we are merely serving, but the people we're partnering with to improve health. And so the impact on me is just really the phenomenal ability to see our researchers. And I know COVID has been a problem, but one benefit of COVID for us, especially in Michigan, that's a fairly large state as far as landmass. Through these studios, you know, we sit at the southeast corner of the state and we have a huge upper peninsula, and it's even allowed us to have people from that part of our state give us feedback via Zoom in these studios. So I just think they've been great.
Wonderful.
This is Fahina from Salt Lake City. I participated on several studios, and I think the impact of it on me is the fact that it's basically, I appreciate the fact that researchers are including the voices of community members, most especially if the research is done on community members. I feel that it's very important that their voices are heard and are part of that. So. And my experiences with the studios, they've been very, especially at the University of Utah, they have been very effective in gathering. What they've done is they've reached out to community members or organizations in the community that are well known within the communities. You know, there's just not any Tom, Dick, or Harry but they're really identifying community members that are working in the communities and have the trust of community members. To represent the voice of the communities. And like I said, I think with that, it's very important that that issues about the communities is that those communities participate.
You can hear some of the commonalities with the themes of just the symbiosis that goes along between the researchers and the community members. Others like to add in their thoughts about the experience with studios and the impact that they've had for you personally.
This is Sarah Simonson. I would like to add from the perspective of a researcher. I'm always really humbled and reminded of that bidirectional, the importance of that bidirectional process, because we often come as researchers with questions we want answered. And I love that community members say, you've got to give back to us. We need this. Like, it's not just how can we help you, but there's always this reminder. I think that it's got to be a partnership, and that there's more work than you would traditionally think of in doing a research study, really important work in terms of working with that community. And I've really appreciated how participants have been real open about that.
Wonderful.
I'm not a researcher. I'm a person that people ask what I think. And when I first got the email, I was very enthusiastic because the running joke in my community is that nobody ever asked us. You know, it's like we'll see a study up and it'll be like, really? You know, is that how you feel? And we'll just kind of laugh at it. And I thought it was very important to get the voices of the community. And I was really proud of U of M for contacting me, and I'm very enthusiastic about it. Just one more thing, and that's that when you do research, or when I do research, one of the things I have to be aware of is that I may come across some things that are not in my thesis. I may come across some information that I was not looking for, but that is very important to the research that I'm doing and makes a big difference. So I'm really glad that I was asked to be a part, and I'm glad for all of the people when we met in Michigan, hearing their voices really made a difference, and to know that they were being listened to.
Thank you. Okay. I'm going to move on to the second question. And the question is, how have studios informed your research or your perspective on research? And I'm going to ask Ms. Clark to start.
It changed my perspective on research because I honestly didn't know that so much went into it. I thought that maybe, you put up a flyer, ask for people to come, you call, and you get people, and you didn't really care what kind of people. You just, it has to fit this. You need to have this, and that. And I think with going to the studios, it helped see where the researchers were like, okay, how do we get this group of people? We want this group of people and more of this group of people, mainly speaking of, African-American community, to come out and to do this and to do that. And that really changed my perspective on research and how they go about it and approach it. I thought, like I said, I thought they just kind of threw it out there and whoever comes, but they actually do care about the people that they get in the research projects. And they were trying to ask us what are the questions that we need to ask? And me, I come from a standpoint usually of a caregiver. I have a child who deals with a illness, sickle cell. So I come from that perspective of what do you need to do to help, get to us, or in certain times of the day that you might need to do the research and how to offer it and things like that. So it was really eye-opening to see, the care that goes into the research projects.
Wonderful. Thank you. Dr. Griffin, you've been quiet.
I have. So I think for me, what studios have done, well, let me just say, I come from being formally trained in community-based participatory research, in community psychology. So partnering with community is not really a foreign concept to me. I also do a lot of qualitative research. So this idea fundamentally is not that necessarily foreign. However, I think what studios have done for me and our work is help us to think even more critically and clearly about how the potential participants actually respond to or think about some of the questions that we're asking. I mean, if you think about a lot of the assumptions that we make about asking essentially closed-ended questions or how they're worded, one of the things that, for example, we just found when we were doing a study on trust, and we were having discussions about, well, we put in questions about we had a lot of conversation within the research team about how should we talk about what are they supposed to trust, whether it was providers, whether it was healthcare systems, and so forth. And when we asked them about, we finally settled on healthcare organizations, and then we sort of presented it to the studio, and they were like, well, do you mean the hospital? Do you mean the health system that they're part of? Do you mean the payers? Do you mean the insurance agents? Do you mean the the nurse practitioner? Like who are you talking about when you're talking about these things? And we thought we did this great job and had our little disclaimer at the beginning of who we were talking about. And they were just like, yeah, that's not, it's still not clear to us. And just to see the diversity of perspectives was really important. There's also it adds for me a lot of practical feedback that has been really helpful in shaping the work that we do.
And Ms. Dawson, I see you shaking your head there. What was resonating with you? Those pesky mute buttons.
To Derek's point about the practical feedback you get and advice that helps you make adjustments to how you're approaching research participants, how you're recruiting into your programs is very helpful. And I know I'm going to bleed over into another question, but for some of our studios, it was very important for us to reach people of color and to have that engagement with especially Black participants around research where there's so much underrepresentation, and to be ready for the honest feedback that stems from the history that people of color have experienced within medical care and medical treatment and medical research. And to realize that it's not just history, but it's presence, that they still suffer disparate care, disparate access, and to have that honest feedback. And so my advice is that if you're ready to engage, be ready for the practical feedback, but be ready for those things that may become uncomfortable for you depending on who you are, but be real and be willing to engage in those real conversations. Don't approach it as you're working on a study subject, approach it as you're working with a person with a great deal of humanity that they're bringing to the study for you, and to respect that feedback and take it no matter how hard it may be for you to hear it.
I love that comment about the past as well as part of the present. So Dr. Griffiths, before I let you speak again, community, from our 3 community members, any added comments on that?
Sure, I can add a few things. I think my perspective of research as I participate in studios is that it's a great opportunity where us community members or patients are able to come together with researchers and to engage and share information with each other. And in so doing, I have found that researchers are not only appreciative, but they feel like that their information are much more relevant, much more patient-centered. They have a patient-centered approach. And especially if you're coming from a different culture, from different other cultures, that it becomes culturally relevant. And especially if their study is focusing on that. There's different culture other than American culture.
I love it. And Dr. Griffin, I'll let you have the final word on this for this question.
Well, this may not be a direct answer to the question, but the analogy that came to me as we were sort of prepping for this was we have to treat research participation and partnership recognizing essentially it's essentially a leisure time activity that we're asking our partners to participate in. We're asking them to take time out of stuff that's really important to them and use that time for stuff that's important to us and that we get paid for that they don't necessarily do either, that they don't get. It's not part of their day job. This is extra time that they're taking to do this to help us and to help others. So you're asking them to take time away from loved ones, friends, family members, and enjoyable activities to do something that may not just necessarily directly benefit them. And so it just kind of, that has always stuck with me, even just thinking about for my community partners historically, that's been something I've had to sort of wrestle with. How much do I burden them with these kind of asks and so forth, and how to negotiate that.
Mm-hmm. So it sounds like that weaving thread of really mutual respect and almost a humbleness of both parts about really being willing to listen and learn from each other. Beautiful. Okay. For our third question, if another researcher or community member asked you whether they should participate in a studio, what would you tell them and why? And I'm going to ask Ms. Hall to start this one.
I would enthusiastically recommend that they participate. The reason is because we need to have our voices heard. There are two, well, many, but I'll only mention two things that come to mind. The first is, of course, my sister who passed away from cancer. And we had heard about the immunotherapy, and we submitted her blood cells because we got so excited about it. We found out that there was no, there was very little of her gene pool, and in a very nice way, they told us there were not enough Black people in that pool for them to match her DNA. And the other thing that came to mind was I'm a retired teacher, and I came across an article of the effect of racism on children, which I taught for over 25 years, and I had never heard about that. I mean, I knew about the effects of racism on in the corporate world, and when I looked at it, it was like, why am I only getting this little piece of information? I tried to find more information on it, and I couldn't. And I'm thinking that if we had more research and more community participation, maybe our researchers' minds would be opened up a little more to ask these questions. You know, maybe these questions would become interesting to them.
Mm-hmm. Makes sense. Okay. I like that. And Dr. Simonson.
So I've enthusiastically promoted studios to a number of people in the College of Nursing where I work on a sort of researcher career perspective. I know people have used studios to get preliminary data that have helped them get NIH funding. So it's been helpful for people in that way. I also think there's a lot of emphasis and like workshops on community engaged research, but I don't think there's a substitute for sitting in a room or on Zoom and actually hearing the voices of people around the research you want to do, whether they view it as important, what the challenges they see are. And I think for people that are new to that world, it's a real nice introduction, including what I mentioned before, that studio participants have been very honest about, we need you to come back with this information. We need more resources about this topic, that I think traditional researchers don't think about that side. It's a nice opening for them into this world.
I love researchers in the air quotes. When you did that, kind of says it takes a different, it's a different type of researcher that embraces community studios. So I think that if you're a researcher, that's a positive thing. Others on this idea of how would you respond if somebody asked you about participating in a studio?
I would definitely tell them to participate. I think one of the main things that I have actually enjoyed is meeting all kinds of different people and all different, ethnic groups, especially if it's like a condition that I have or someone I know has and someone else has, and it's to actually sit there and hear their stories about things that went on in their lives with their person or with them. So it's I guess almost like a little, for us, I guess not the researchers, almost like a little support group, and you get to learn things and you find people and interacting and just it's a great way of discussing different conditions or things like that maybe some people you don't get to talk to about it, and meet different people and meet new people and learn from different cultures and different lifestyles, things like that. There was one that we did, and there was a transgender gentleman, and he told me, he's like, you can ask me whatever. I was like, great. It's like, I have questions. And it was just great that I was able to speak to him. And it was just things like that I've gotten to know a lot of the participants in the studios and have become really good friends with them.
That concept of the support group, I think, is key. Mm-hmm.
I wanted to just to add that yeah, I would definitely like agree with what everybody else would say, have shared. I mean, um, and then it's important for me, when I ask people to participate, that, it's important to let them know that their input really will help the researcher better design and implement their research, and most especially if it's in regarding to their community. But lastly, I would also recommend to them that if they are going to participate in such, that they also require the researchers to report back to them or share with them what that final thing is. If they're going to share their information, that they too, researchers would need to report back to them on the outcome of what they've done.
Wonderful. Wonderful.
Can I add one quick point? I have been.
Let me think about that. I'm just kidding. Go ahead.
I've been so impressed with the ability of the University of Utah to pull together studios on really specific groups. I think you guys have talked about this throughout the day, but we're working on one right now for rural women that have experienced depression during pregnancy or after pregnancy, which is such a narrow group. We've done one on brown and Black people who have high blood pressure and or short sleep, and they've been able to find people that really understand the topic we're working on.
Wonderful. Thank you. Any last comments on that?
Yeah, the only quick thing I'll add is only do it if you're actually open to the feedback.
Mm-hmm.
If you're not, then don't. I mean, I don't want to be tacky and impolite, but don't waste people's time if you're not really serious about really taking into account and absorbing and integrating the feedback. Make sure that you have enough time to actually do it, and you're not just checking off a box, that you do it early enough in the study design and the application process to be able to incorporate the feedback in a very substantive, thoughtful way.
Wonderful. Respecting people's time is all.
I just wanted to say that for the brain injury panel that I sat on, I was very impressed with the researcher, or with the doctor, how patient he was when he answered all of our questions in a way that we can understand, and how he really seemed to pay, to want to know what we thought and to take it into consideration in his research. And I was impressed with that. And I felt that it meant something, me being there, because when they first said brain injury, I'm like, I don't know anything about brain injuries. But his explanations, his questions, and his answers were very, they gave me a sense that he really, really wanted to know. He was not wasting my time. And I also agree that I'm invested in these panels, and I would like to know the end result. I would like to know the end of the research, what happens, what their final results were.
That need for the feedback to make sure that the information gets back to the community. I think that's a key point. And Ms. Hall, since you were the last one speaking, I'm going to have you respond to the next question first. And that is, how do or can studios impact the community, particularly efforts to eliminate racial and ethnic disparities in health and healthcare outcomes?
I would say the main thing is to listen, and not just listen with a preconceived notion of what you want to hear, but listen for what you had not thought about. I think it's very important for my community to feel that they're being listened to. I've sat on a number of tables, at a number of tables for my voice, but no one has heard what I said. And I get the feeling that I was there just to fulfill, somebody's, like you say, check off a box, to fulfill somebody's requirement. And so I would urge that you listen. The feedback would be great, that we know we're being listened to. And the way that you answer the questions, I think is very important. I think this whole idea of asking the community is wonderful, but don't let it stop there. Please don't let it stop there. Please let it actually make a difference.
Wonderful. And Ms. Dawson, Dr. Dawson, can you pick up on right there. I saw that head shake, so I've learned to know that you got something that you're going to add to that. So.
I think the very important point to make is that the studio may be the launch of a conversation. It should not be the stop of the engagement with your participants. And especially for me in the area of diversity, when you're trying to build a relationship with community of color, don't just be the person that's sucking information out of them, but then not providing service and being responsive to the feedback. One thing our participants in Michigan, Ms. Hall and her counterparts they're very honest about, especially the University of Michigan. We're a very large, very elite institution. And a lot of people of color are hesitant to use our services, even though we're one of the top health systems in the country, because of experience with in the past, because of a perceived issue and a very real issue of how we communicate with our patients or treat the community. And so don't just set up these studios to communicate. Make sure you're going to have resources to follow up, to truly engage, to truly relationship build, and to truly serve the community in which you sit. And be very conscientious in your efforts in doing that.
Wonderful, thank you. Dr. Griffin.
I think from the researcher side, one of the questions that often this kind of conversation brings up is, so how do we disseminate that information back to the community? The great thing is a studio can help you figure that out. So you don't have to figure out all these questions that we come up with. Well, how do we do this? How do we do that? We don't have to actually figure it out by ourselves. You can actually use this tool to get that information about what are the best ways to disseminate the information back to the community. What are the vehicles through which it's going to be most received, most heard, most widely disseminated. Those are things that we really need to, that's why you do, these kinds of tools. This is why you engage people, is to really know how to meet them where they are. And so I think just those very basics are really important.
You think you muted yourself at the end of that sentence.
Oh, I was just saying that those are the kinds of things, some of those very basic pragmatic things are, are just some of the tools that you can use to ways you can use studios.
Wonderful, thank you, thank you. Others? I'm looking at Ms. Tavaki Pasi. You can't tell that I'm looking at you.
Well, personally, I think that if if we're in the process of wanting to eliminate racial, ethnic disparities and health disparities, all that kind of stuff, we need to get to the root of it, and we need to identify the root of those disparities. And identifying the roots of those disparities can only come from the source. And so studios is very impactful because they serve as voices for the community when you're recruiting the people from the community. So personally, I think the way we work those studios and recruit the folks, we can actually get some really good outcomes on how to address our health disparities within our ethnic communities.
Wonderful, great point. From the source, getting the information from the source. Ms. Hall.
I'm sorry, I just wanted to add a point to Ms. Dawson's point. I'm a cancer survivor, and someone had recommended U of M as a hospital for me to go to. And I agreed with that person that U of M is an excellent, excellent hospital. But what I said was, they can have the best care in the world, but if I don't receive it, it means nothing to me. And that was my hesitancy in going and switching over to U of M, was because we all know that it's a great hospital, but we don't know that it responds to people of color. We don't know that people of color will go there and get that great care. And so that's why I was doubly really, really happy to participate in the community engagement. When I saw I had heard from my doctor and from other people at U of M that they were working on it, but when I saw the email, I was very, very pleased. It's like, okay, they're serious. They really want to do this thing. But there is a meme, there's lore going on in the community that once you have been identified as a racist organization, that spreads, as bad news spreads fast, that spreads throughout the community. And Ms. Dawson is going to have a big job in uh, countering that information, because word of mouth, you know, you trust your neighbors, you trust your friends. So good luck.
Good point.
I'll help.
Uh-huh. So you got some help there. Dr. Simonson.
One thing that I think has been interesting is that as researchers, we often come with a topic, you know, how to improve sleep, or, you know, something very specific and often very medical. And I've found that these studios and other approaches where you really engage the community help you understand these other factors, social determinants, you know, discrimination, and how they underlie this problem. So honestly, you can't really address the problem from your biomedical perspective without understanding all of these other issues, and the voices of the community bring that in and help us think about that and how to address that to be more effective in improving the health outcome that we're seeing.
Changing perspectives has to start somewhere, and it's kind of one step at a time. So very good points. The last formal question, because I've seen questions coming up in the chat, and that's kind of my side view there, is beyond activities like this summit, how can the studio model be marketed to institutions and other researchers? And I'll ask Ms. Clark to start.
To market it, I guess I would think that for my group, it would be more like something to market, to maybe show or demonstrate or give an example. Because honestly, at first, when I said that I would do a studio, I thought that I was doing a research study. I didn't realize that the studio was meant to get everything together for the research study and things like that. So I don't think a lot of people understand, you know, just like non-research or non-people that aren't in the medical field or things like that, understand what the studio is really all about. And maybe doing a short little demonstration or something on YouTube or TikTok, because that's kind of where my little generation lives. Or something like that, like a skit or something to show what it is. Maybe that would help with the marketing, because honestly, I wouldn't have just you saying it and maybe just, you know, giving a little spill about it really doesn't show you kind of what it is. It's more visual, I think, would help out. But that's, you know, that's just from my take of a non-medical person here.
TikTok. Okay, writing
TikTok,
that down.
you go down that TikTok rabbit hole, you're there for like 4 hours. It's a world of knowledge.
It's a world of something.
It is.
Others. Beyond the studio, I mean, beyond the summit, how can the studio model be marketed?
Well, I hate to say research is going to help, you know, promote this kind of tool to help do research, but I think actually studying how and why it is effective, you know, I guess technically if it's effective, by actually being able to document, you know, and compare studies that have used this tool to inform the studies and to, you know, inform how they've actually done, both qualitatively and quantitatively, how they're compared to those that have not. I think there's some, you know, it wouldn't to me just be which one got funded and so forth, but I think more the qualitative for me would be more meaningful, because it's going to get at some of the information that the researchers can, I mean, I think being able to do this and actually being able to document this is going to be really important. But getting that information out, giving it to researchers who are trying to write proposals. I mean, we come at this from a very pragmatic standpoint. We're trying to get funded and we're trying to build research careers and keep jobs. So, I mean, this is, you know, if this is going to help us do that, then we're going to be all for it, or at least the smart ones will. So
it's got some of the personal benefits also. Nice. Okay. Dr. Simons.
If you can emphasize the impact of the research. So is there some sustainability of what you've studied or interventions in the community that you would see more with this model, and even satisfaction of participants, your ability to really recruit diverse participants. And then I think what a lot of researchers want is to have one study build to the next study so you can move the science along. So how could you demonstrate that this model really facilitates not just one study done well, but progression of research to really help community?
Nice. Others? See if you can tell if I'm looking at you. Ms. Hall, anything to add there? Ms. Dawson?
I was just going to say that I think
I felt it. I felt that you had something to say there.
all of those suggestions have been really, really excellent. And I would say participating in one, I think, you learn from experience, and just having, maybe have someone come in and experience an actual studio to see what goes on, to give them a good idea of what's happening there. And again, letting the feedback from the study, once the study is done, this study is different from another study because of community engagement.
So it sets it apart.
Right.
Excellent. Any last thoughts or comments on the marketing of the studios? Ms. Dawson, I can just read your face. What do you want to add there? It's gonna explode.
I think my situation is a bit unique because I'm always recruiting so that there's a wealth of information for researchers across our campus through our Michigan Genomics Initiative. Even though we're a Michigan Medicine Initiative, we make the research and the electronic health records and the genetic records of these patients available to all researchers at the University of Michigan. And so in promoting studios, I'm able to say to researchers, MGI has the unique ability to recontact our patients for additional information, but as part of that package, the unique ability to tell them, and we're also able to get them in a room or on a Zoom for you so you can have direct communications that will help you address potential biases in your research, or how you're promoting your research, or how you're communicating about your research. So it's an added benefit and service that we provide to our campus through this very important resource of the Michigan Genomics Initiative. And so I'm providing you a service, researcher, and it's an effective way because they need that resource. And it's things they don't have to do on their own. They no longer have to find a way to pay for it. They no longer have to find the time to do it for themselves. It's a service that will provide them.
Wonderful. Thank you. Well, I wanted to make sure that we left time for questions from the chat and from the audience. But just some of the themes that I heard over the course of those 5 questions or so, the importance of launching the conversation. Okay. The fact that the studios are bi-directional, okay, that the community has the opportunity to feel heard, right? And then the opportunity for feedback, as well as meeting people where they are. And the last one is from the source. So just some of the themes that I noted down during that. And I wanted to open it up to questions, and for the I'll call it the chat trolls, those who've been monitoring the chat, can you let us know some of the questions that have been raised that we can pose to the panelists?
Sure, Dr. Kim. The first one we have is for Dr. Griffith. The question is, how have you used studios within the CBPR research, looking for pros and cons of using this model versus other community engagement methods, such as advisory boards or including community members as part of your study team?
So to start with the point that one of my community partners from Flint used to say all the time, I think for me, it's a both and, not an either or. Each of those approaches offers something very different to the conversation. and by having a community partner, basically work alongside you to develop, a study and really a program of research from the beginning is a very different thing than having an advisory board kind of speak to some specifics of particular studies. And then this tool of community engagement studios for me is more akin to my qualitative hat, I would say member checking, where you're getting information from people to see if the way that you're approaching it and thinking about it is correct. And to get information about, again, for me, it ends up being very practical things about how do you word this? Where should I go for that? How do I reach people for this? What site should I use for that? So I think it really complements it in a way, because usually the other groups are kind of set and smaller, and they're usually folks that we go back to on a regular basis or have long-term partners. But this gives you sort of a fresh look at the community and from a very different perspective.
Thank you. And Colleen, next question.
So I've got one other question here. So while I'm asking it, everyone who's been so attentive, please feel free to chat additional ones. I think we touched on this a little bit with some of the earlier questions, but to the community experts specifically, how should we, I guess from the research community, be messaging studios to people who have no experience with research or that may think negatively about research?
Ms. Hall.
I would approach it as a conversation. I would market it. I would approach it as saying, we would like to have a conversation with you about this research that we're doing. Emphasis on conversation because it's an exchange of ideas. I'll leave it there.
I would also like to, I think it's really important that researchers, if they identify like people in the community that are trusted by that community that they're trying to reach, if they could partner up with some of those people and have them help recruit some of the people for their studio. That always, trust is a very important issue in the community. So if they trust the people that are coming to them, I think they would have researchers would have an easier time of recruiting.
So in some communities, it's called the gatekeeper. So finding and meeting that community gatekeeper. And if they're on board, then you may be able to bring others, or they may be able to bring others with them. Ms. Clark, you look like I saw a little spark in your eye, like you had something to add there.
No, that's definitely one of the ways I would say, because especially in the African-American community, because of history, we do not trust a lot of research studies and things like that. And if you do have someone like my mom's the one that reached out to me and told me about this and things like that. So I know if she's okay with it, then I'm okay with doing it and participating. So it's just one of those things, definitely, is you have to have someone that you know and trust, or someone in the community that says, okay, this is what we're doing. It's kind of like, even with right now, I see a lot of pastors are doing question and answers for the vaccine. And that's mainly, because a lot of people might not trust anyone but their pastor. And if they're giving these questions and these answers, they might feel a little bit more comfortable getting the vaccine and things like that. So I think that's definitely the gatekeeper technique, yes.
Mm-hmm. Wonderful. So gatekeepers being some of our faith-based organizations that can help with that. Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Also, I just want to throw in, I think sometimes for researchers, sometimes it would be really great if they, and it's kind of like a win-win kind of a situation here, if they have students within that community that are at the university, to kind of partner up with some of the students from those community, and the students can help to also recruit people from their community. And not only, will the researcher get what they need, but that will kind of help, the student build his his experience.
Definitely. Again, making it bi-directional, okay, and as symbiotic. All right.
If I could just add just my own little caveat to that is I wouldn't it's very easy for researchers as we become more established to become more separate from the community. So my only hesitation is, yes, you can send students out to do different things. You can send them out to be part of teams and so forth, but they also need to see you. If you're the PI, if you're the lead, your face matters and you need to be out there. No, I know you don't have time to again, be out there all the time, but you do need to be able to be seen, be visible, for people to be able to see, touch, and talk. Well, not touch you during COVID, but at least see you as a real person and hear from you directly, as opposed to it just being always filtered through a team of other people.
Wonderful.
I just want to add to that point. One of my PIs, I belong to the largest Black church in Ann Arbor. So a lot of times when they're doing community outreach in Ann Arbor, it's with my church. And one of my PIs who had reached out to us to do a thing, he actually came to church one Sunday, unannounced, unexpected. He communed with the people, he worshiped with the people, and everyone commented about how much they appreciated that because they felt a sincerity in his efforts and what he was doing. And he's an Indian man, he's Hindu, but he came and he was comfortable and he enjoyed himself and they really enjoyed him. So to Derek's point, they need to see you and they need to feel you too. Be real, be authentic, meet them where they are.
Wonderful. Authentic and meet them where they are. Other questions? We have a couple more minutes before the session ends.
So I'll jump in with a question of my own. We've spent the last day and a half and this panel talking about all the really great things about community engagement studios, but sometimes the most interesting thing is to find out when it's not the right solution. So can researchers and the community members maybe talk about a time where maybe a community engagement studio is not a good fit or shouldn't be used as your method of engagement on a project?
Dr. Griffin.
Again, my first answer is kind of similar to what I said before, is if you do it so late in the process that you're really just trying to check a box, it's going to be frustrating to you to have information that you can't bring into the study. And it's going to be frustrating for those who took their time to participate to hear that it didn't make it in there. So I think you have to do it early enough in the process and early enough time that you can actually incorporate the feedback. I think that for me is key.
I think it's kind of touching back on what Ms. Hall said earlier, that if you're just going to have a studio just to have a studio, but not really listen to the voice of those who you've recruited to come, I think that's a time not to have a studio if you're really not going to listen to the input.
It gets back to what was said earlier about don't waste time. Don't waste the participants' time if you're not serious about utilizing the information that you have been granted. Good points. Okay. One last question from I call it the Brady Bunch squares, but from the audience. Okay. One last question, going once, going twice. Excellent. Well, to our panelists, I thank you for your input, for your feedback and your thought. And that's both for the community and our researchers. I hope that this information will be particularly helpful following the examples of the studios and the feedback and the conversations we've had over the last day and a half. And I think that I have actually granted 5 minutes. So to the program people, note that I granted 5 minutes extra at the end of the session. So thank you all, and I'll turn it back over.
Thanks, Dr. Kim. You're the best for giving us 5 minutes and in general. Alicia, do you want to take over from here?
What we're going to do next, we do have extra 5 minutes. So if folks want to stretch, take a bio break, and we're also going to come back then in 5 minutes, right at 2 o'clock Central, to launch a poll. And then we will be going into the last breakout rooms of the day, and these are of your choice. So thank you to our panelists. You saw their interesting profiles in the red carpet, and now you get to know them even more. And it looks like Kyra would like to meet Dr. Griffith. So there are some chats already asking for some connections outside of the summit. And we appreciate everyone's candor and being with us today. Thank you. And thank you, Dr. Kim.
My pleasure.
All right, everybody, it is a little after 2 o'clock. I'll go ahead and put up our last poll. If Leah or Tiffany or Devin wants to introduce the last poll, I'm going to put it up right now. There's everyone's last poll.
Devin,
I'm not here. Oh, go ahead, Tiffany.
I was just going to say, Devin hasn't done a poll today. Devin, want to do a poll?
Oh, well, I was muted. This is why we can't have nice things, because I don't know how to unmute myself. Okay, y'all. So we have our last poll. It's for 700. What was the most difficult facilitation challenge?
There's really not an all of the above for this one.
Do not abuse the people who put the polls in the system. We'll give it like another 30 seconds, Devin, and then we'll shut it down and you can reveal the answer.
Colleen, I feel like you know the answer to this one.
I
Devin.
do, because leadership came back to talk to me about the answer to this one.
It was
institutional leadership.
Hold on, we're not closed yet.
Devin, am I allowed to ask a question?
I think George had a question, Devin.
Yes, go ahead, George.
Oh, well, cat is out of the bag. I wasn't going to identify myself in asking the question, but what really is the meaning of the dollar amount at each of the questions? Are we all getting that amount? Is that the idea?
It would be nice if we were getting, that would be really great. We just wanted to be fun and pretend like it was Jeopardy. But yes, it would be so wonderful if we could write that in the budget maybe for next time.
Okay, so Devin, that's the NIA trip on the call. So
well, now you know why I wasn't going to identify myself. Okay.
Devin, stop talking.
Okay, so I think we are done. So it looks like the majority of folks said a community expert who was also a retired physician. No, wait, I'm just kidding. Just kidding. The majority of folks said a PI would not stop talking over community experts in spite of several redirections. That has happened several times, but the most challenging or difficult facilitation challenge was actually a community expert who began yelling during the studio at the facilitator and the study team, and said the entire project and institution was unethical. Yes, so that was incredibly a difficult situation. Tiffany was facilitating that meeting and handled the situation wonderfully, I might add. So that was definitely a challenge, but we definitely worked with that participant, and we did our best we put her into a breakout room where I actually spoke to her to kind of get to the bottom of her concerns, and in order to understand, what her perspective was. But Tiffany, do you want to add anything?
Yeah, I guess I would just say that this was via a Zoom studio. And obviously, as you all can imagine, it caught us quite off guard. And so I let the person have a few minutes to vent because I felt like that was obvious that this person needed this space to vent. And then I proceeded to validate her experience and say, you know, I think that the fact that you had a negative experience is really important for the research team to hear, because we certainly don't want that to happen to other people. And I appreciate you being vulnerable and sharing that. And I can sense how emotional and frustrating this experience was for you. And so I don't want you to think that because you've said that, we're not going to continue this conversation. As we move around and ask the rest of these questions, I hope, you know, you will let that inform your answers so the research team and our team can make sure that never happens to another patient again. And she said, thank you. And then thought she had muted herself, but then yelled to her husband in the background, something like, I hate this place. So she ended up actually spending about an hour and a half with Devin, I think, on the telephone, if I'm not mistaken. And as Colleen mentioned, she did end up actually troubleshooting with our hospital leadership, like the hospital leadership regarding this incident. So I don't
It
know.
was a Friday night email that was directed to me from my boss's boss that had all of institutional leadership CC'd on it. And the question was, what happened? And with regard to what Daniel asked about inviting the partner back, while we did collect her feedback as they indicated, after talking with institutional leadership, they had indicated that this was one of those folks that had trouble with the institution regularly. And so they asked if we could just omit this particular person from attending future studios, because as we talked about before, sometimes there's so much of a trigger issue or a bias that it's not a good fit for the studio if they, for instance, have such a problem with the institution that you represent or the investigator represents that they can't get past that to give actionable feedback about other elements. And so we have a very small but mighty do not fly list of folks that thank you, but maybe we just will part ways.
I will say to our institution's credit, number one, it was very validating to hear from them that they felt like our team had handled it most appropriately. And so that made me feel really good about our team. And then secondly, we were so fortunate that the two PIs that were leading the research project that were a part of this studio were phenomenal. They were humble, they were gracious, they welcomed her feedback, and were so apologetic, even though they clearly had nothing to do with this person's experience. They still, on behalf of the institution, on behalf of researchers, of physicians, et cetera, they were phenomenal. So I think we really lucked out that we had a great research team and that our team, Devin and Leah and I working together, were able to meet the needs of this particular community expert in a way that I think took a little bit of finesse that we weren't used to using. So that's it. That's our last poll. And we will not be handing out cash related to the polls. I want to make that clear.
No, we cannot do that.
But you're welcome for your snack magic box. My daughter just walked in and took my birthday cake snacks. She took them, friends. I am without.
Right. We're going to roll into breakout rooms next. Is that correct?
That's correct. We're going to do our breakout rooms. So if there was a burning issue that you wanted more feedback on, that you would like to have maybe a smaller group discussion about, we've got several categories that we've lined up for you that you can see in the slides, and they will have individuals and moderators in each of the categories. So just, you can pick a breakout room. And then if you get your MEDNet in one breakout room, but want to jump into another, come back to the main space, and Alicia and Colleen will help navigate you into another breakout room.
Welcome back, everyone. It is 2:40 Central, and I'm just going to do some housekeeping announcements and then pass it to Stephanie Miller-Hughes, our summit chair. So thank you for staying with us the whole day today and yesterday, and knowing that you have received your post-evaluation at this time. So again, folks who complete it by 9 p.m. Central on Monday will be entered into the pottery raffle, and we do have videos showing the origin and creation of these pieces. Thank you, Ed Napia, for that. And also, as we mentioned, we have been recording. We're capturing the chats. We also had your headshots for those who authorized them. So give us some time to collate, put these all together into a readable and visually attractive format so that that can be shared and we can continue our collaborations in the community engagement studio space beyond the summit. Thank you again, everyone. Dr. Miller-Hughes.
Well, it has been a good, invigorating, exciting last day and a half, almost 2 days. I just wanted to to our attendees, thank you for joining us, and your engagement has been inspiring. There's networking that is happening. And so we appreciate your being here. I think there's a lot of efforts around kind of either developing the CE Studio model or enhancing it in your own areas. I think that is just fabulous. I want to thank our subcommittees for putting this all together. We had a logistics committee, we had a expert panel prep and dissemination, we had oversight and implementation, and we still have a little bit of work to do around dissemination, but this has been this has been our biggest milestone to date. So getting here has been great. I want to send a special shout out to all of our facilitators. I'm going to say names, and so you guys just throw darts in if I get. So Tiffany, Bria, Bree, Leah, Devin, Jillian, who am I missing there? Megan. You know, so everyone came for this training and this amazing training, and you guys did an amazing job. I mean, doing this work is hard, and you guys put together something yesterday, just a live demo, you know, with everyone watching, and so your stars shone brightly, and so we could not be more excited and proud of you guys. So you really made this a great summit for all of us. I want to thank our panel speakers are probably not still here, but they really helped to show that we weren't making this all up, right? So we got some validation for what we were saying about this model, and so that has been, you know, fantastic. I do want to send a special shout out to my co-chair, Alicia Fair, who I've known about 20 years before we had two last names, right, Alicia? So, you know, logistics, all of this comes together. You need the logistics and people hearing your ideas and putting it all together. And Alicia has had run a show for us, and I mean, this has been a production, and so, I mean, it's been a team effort, but Alicia has really taken the lead on this and getting us all together. So Alicia, I thank you, and pleasure to still work with you after all these years. I want to, you know, turn it over to Tiffany. This has been Tiffany's baby. I mean, we all know Tiffany's amazing. She's a co-developer of this model. She's been wanting to do this for some time, so I think it only fitting that she closes out. But I'm just thankful to be acquainted with you and all this great work that everyone's doing. So again, so thanks to everyone, and I'll hand it over to you, Tiffany.
Thank you, Stephanie. That was very humbling. As you can see, we have the opportunity to work with really phenomenal people, so we're very lucky. And so if you'll, literally, this will take just a couple of minutes, so if you'll be patient with me, I also just want to thank you guys for the investment of your time. This was 2 days of your time, and we are honored that you chose to spend it with us. We hope you found some value in it. We hope you found some inspiration. Please know that our support of you and our mentorship of you in implementing this model does not end here today. We quite often do one-off consultations. We'll do a Zoom, we'll do a phone call. We loved chatting with Heidi frequently to help her get her program started. I feel like we were able to build like a relationship there. So when I go to New Mexico, I will definitely be hanging out with Heidi. So this is an opportunity for us to collect colleagues from across the country, right? For us to have those people that we can call on. And I also wanted to thank our co-PIs, because without Stephanie, this would not happen. Her willingness to be the lead on this grant is we were so grateful for it. And obviously, as you could tell, Alicia is running the show. And so we were really grateful for her keeping us on track. And it was just really fun to collaborate with everybody. I do want to encourage folks to use the CE Adopters Group as a resource and a support as you move forward to implement your program, even if you're just thinking about it and you're not at a place of implementation. It is a great resource to talk and connect with colleagues, but also to access templates, sample recommendations, facilitation guides, publications, and you can post questions in there. Hey, I'm thinking about doing a studio on this topic, would love to get feedback or would love to connect with anyone, and people can then connect you with resources. And then I think most importantly, as you all move forward, I hope you'll seek out opportunities for us to all collaborate, whether it's helping each other with recruitment for studios through our Facebook page or our existing database, or Buffalo's been wonderful sharing their resources, or I've had other colleagues across the country who have said, oh, send me a flyer, we'll push it out. So we can help each other make these successful. And I think there's a lot of opportunities for us to collaborate on funding. and to really push this model forward and to analyze it and to prove that it's a valuable model for patient engagement and can in fact improve and enhance research. And so lastly, I guess I would just like to say thanks, and we're here for you. And I hope you have a phenomenal weekend. And I hope to see you all again real soon. And that's all I have. Alicia?
We also wanted to say thank you to Picori and Courtney Clyett, who is on this call. We have worked with her in other capacities in community engagement. So like Tiffany said, the organization team, most of us have worked together in other ways, but never in this one large joint effort. But without Picori, we would not be able to convene here today. So thank you for believing in the work. As we said at the beginning of the day yesterday, Tiffany is the original visionary with other coworkers who aren't at Vanderbilt anymore, but she's the visionary behind this model. So thank you for believing in us and supporting us. And OG, yes, she is the OG. And I think the hashtag channel your inner Tiffany is another one we need to put out. But yes, we want to acknowledge Picori, and as you saw the funding sources on our slides. Thank you, Courtney Clyett, for being there for us.
Yes, thanks, thanks, thanks.
Everybody have a wonderful weekend. Take care of yourself and be safe. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye, it was wonderful. Thank you. Thank you, everyone. It's hard to leave.
Thank you so much.
Alicia, do you need anything else? Stephanie?
I have a list of things for next week. No, it's for next week. Just when you guys wanted to meet next week to talk about everything, or where you want to house everything.
Yeah, next week.
Next week. Okay. All right.
Yeah, that sounds good. Next week.
I've been trying to look at, I really am camera ready. Also, I think I can stop recording. We just witnessed a car accident across the street. So while this was happening,
oh my goodness,
we had men crawling in the ceiling, pulling out wires and using words that we're glad we were muted. So yes, so there's been a lot going on here at the Alliance, but yeah, I'll just, we'll catch up next week.
Sounds good. I was gonna say, Stephanie, I feel like I was just following you around from breakout room.
From breakout room,
like whatever breakout room you were in, I just would appear.
I just want you all to know, I don't know.